There is a declassified document that is so mind-boggling, so broad, and so deep that it's almost impossible to summarize. The holographic universe, the nature of consciousness, non-human intelligences, out-of-body experiences, seeing or perceiving information across space and time. This military intelligence document openly states that human consciousness is capable of accessing higher planes of reality. It even tells you exactly how to do it. It's called Analysis and Assessment of the Gateway Process. But what is this document? Is it some bizarre, pseudo-scientific, Cold War curiosity? Or is it truly one of the most consequential documents to ever emerge from the classified intelligence world? Well, my friends, you can decide for yourself, because in this transmission, we are going to read the entire sprawling analysis and assessment of gateway process document from front to back. Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. And if this sounds familiar, that is because you likely know that I already read through this document on the channel, but I did so in 3 separate parts over the course of several weeks. But since then, I've noticed a couple of what I think are pretty consequential things. One, part 3 of the read through by far for some reason got the least traction, which is crazy because I think it contains the most novel nuggets, and actually it's the longest transmission. So a lot of people missed out on what I think is clearly the most important part of this whole document. And also, this document is just so singular, so unique, so insane in its scope that I think it is worth revisiting even if you've already watched all 3 parts of my read through or read it yourself. Despite that, I'm not saying this document is perfect. I'm not saying this document has all of the secrets in the universe. And that's actually one thing about some of the other coverage of this document that bothers me is, yeah, I get that you have to play into that as a creator to some degree, but you gotta be able to critique the thing. You gotta be able to identify its limitations, where it may be falling short, where it may be misunderstanding some things. And I'm not saying, again, that I do the best job of that through this read through, but I can tell you the thing is not perfect. But that said, oh my God, my friends, is this thing juicy? So that's kind of my rationale for bringing you this supercut version of this document. And I'm not going to drag out the context here too much because I know I do give some context along the way. It's also worth noting that I did chop off some of the sort of, teaser, sizzler intro reels. I did keep the first one to just sort of set the tone. I can't resist but riff for a couple of minutes on why I think this document remains so alive and so relevant to the time that we're living in now. Because for one, and this is another thing that's adjacent to the point I was just about to make, it really provides an amazing through line of a lot of the core topics that this channel explores. I mean, let's start with simulation theory, for instance. This thing was written in 1983, my friends, and that's essentially the view of reality that the document describes, with some important caveats. Specifically, it characterizes reality as a sort of consciousness-based hologram, a consciousness fractal that we're all nodes in, a consciousness-based simulation, really. So somehow, a lieutenant colonel in the Army in 1983 was describing reality as a consciousness-based simulation, essentially. This is not his original ideas, of course. If you've gone deeper into this document, into the sources, into the inspirations, even the names that they list off in the document itself, this is inspired by people like Itzhak Bentov, the great physicist David Bohm. But regardless, incredible, still highly relevant stuff. Then there's the topic of NHI, non-human intelligence. And I think the take on the nature of that consciousness that's presented in this paper, though it's really something that's kind of talked about more in passing, I think the take is very sophisticated and in line with my own thinking. So essentially that NHI, or at least the entities spoken of in this document, are like higher intelligences that exist in other planes of reality, what they call other energy systems. Places that are largely mental outside of space-time. And it is possible to connect with these entities, these higher consciousnesses, through our own consciousness. And remember, again, 1983, my friends, the phenomenon has come a long way. The UFO conversation has come a long way. People at very high levels are talking about these topics now, but they really weren't back then, at least not in a public way. So again, very unique example of that. Lastly, I have to mention that there are a lot of Platonic and esoteric and hermetic links in this document, although they don't specifically use that language. I mean, just generally, Plato's cave, the idea that we don't live in baseline reality, that we're stuck in a proverbial sensory cave watching shadows on a wall, right? The famous scenario Plato outlines in his Republic. This gateway process paper, and really the gateway process in general, is essentially a modern, updated treatise on how we can climb out of the cave, at least to some degree. Because a core part of this theory is that we are more than our physical bodies, and that our true nature is non-physical, psychical. This is a method for waking up to that reality, a method for awakening these psychical capacities that allow us to really experience these higher realms, allegedly. Where the Platonists and Hermeticists talk about the highest state of consciousness being pure communion with the One, this document talks about communion with the Absolute, and it considers the Absolute to be sort of the highest truth, the highest principle of reality. So in a lot of ways, at least, this is pretty much indistinguishable from a lot of esoteric traditions and what they've been teaching for thousands of years. So my friends, whether you're here for the lore, the science, the potential spiritual implications, or just out of curiosity, settle in. Settle in for the whole shebang for what, like I said, continues to be one of the most mind-boggling, insane documents in existence, at least that we have access to. The analysis and assessment of gateway process. What if I told you that your consciousness can transcend space and time, escape the physical matrix, tap into the one true consciousness behind the universal hologram, that you can even leave your physical body? Well, if it were just me saying this, I would absolutely say, don't believe me. But the fact of the matter is, it is not just me. These statements are the product of decades of research by the military and intelligence agencies, and they are all spelled out explicitly in the now declassified analysis and assessment of the gateway process. Now, if you're just hearing this for the first time, I'm sure you, like me honestly, are thinking to yourself, this cannot be true. But it is. Or at least it seems to be. And to be completely honest with you, I am way past the point of initial doubt, not just because I've done so much research on this at this point, but because I myself, as some of you know, did attend a gateway retreat at Monroe Institute just a few months ago. And yes, it was profound. Yes, I did leave my body. Yes, that is just as reality quaking as it sounds. Full story and a lot more background on all of this in this video. But back to the document itself, what does it really say? How is it really possible? What is the point of this thing? Well, those questions and many more will be answered in this very read-through, my friends. If this is your first exposure to the document, this thing is pretty dense. It approaches all of these topics, again, consciousness, transcending space and time, leaving the body, etc., from a number of angles, from the practical and theoretical to the scientific and technical. But before we crack this thing open, just a little bit of background. Why would these agencies, the military, the intelligence agencies, be interested in this topic? Why would they do this research? Well, there is, in fact, an incredibly rich multi-decades-long history behind those questions, but for the purposes of this transmission, I'm going to keep it brief. The fact of the matter is, this paper is not just some esoteric one-off. It's part of a much broader effort during the Cold War to investigate consciousness, remote viewing, psychic spying, ESP, enhanced learning, and psi phenomena in general. And if you want to know more about the history, if that just served to pique up your curiosity, I totally understand. Again, I plug this video. And also look into Robert Monroe, his books, and Project Stargate, just for starters. So with that, what do these agencies find? And does this gateway process document really hold the keys to the hidden abilities of human consciousness? Does it really allow us to peer behind the curtain of the Matrix? Well, my friends, let's find out. I've been wanting to do this for a while, and now with the timing of all of these recent revelations regarding UAP disclosure, the involvement of, in quotes, psionic assets and how closely related it is to this gateway report, I feel like now is just such a synchronistic time to finally dive into what I think is one of the most novel, incredible documents that I've ever come across. I'm just going to get into this. I don't know how long this is going to take. I think I'll go for somewhere between 45 minutes, an hour. We'll see when we get to a good place to conclude part one, but I do anticipate that this will take multiple goes. Anyway, with that, the analysis and assessment of the gateway process. You asked me to provide an assessment of the gateway experience in terms of its mechanics and ultimate practicality. As I set out to fulfill that tasking, it soon became clear that in order to assess the validity and practicality of the process, I needed to do enough supporting research and analysis to fully understand how and why the process works. Frankly, sir, that proved to be an extremely involved and difficult business. Initially, based on conversations with a physician who took the gateway training with me, I had recourse to the biomedical models developed by Itzhak Bentov to obtain information concerning the physical aspects of the process. Then I found it necessary to dive into various sources for further information concerning quantum mechanics in order to be able to describe the nature and functioning of human consciousness. I had to be able to construct a scientifically valid and reasonably lucid model of how consciousness functions under the influence of the brain hemisphere synchronization technique employed by Gateway. Once this was done, the next step involved recourse to theoretical physics in order to explain the character of the time-space dimension and the means by which expanded human consciousness transcends it in achieving Gateway's objectives. Finally, I again found it necessary to use physics to bring the whole phenomenon of out-of-body states into the language of physical science to remove the stigma of its occult connotations. So many stigmas with those occult connotations. We don't want any occult in our out-of-body and exotic consciousness research. We want it straight down the middle. Remove the stigma of its occult connotations and put it in a frame of reference suited to objective assessment. 2. I began the narrative by briefly profiling the fundamental biomedical factors of affecting such related techniques as hypnosis, biofeedback, and transcendental meditation so that their objectives and mode of functioning would be compared in the reader's mind with the gateway process as the model of its underlying mechanics was developed. Additionally, that introductory material is useful in supporting the conclusions of the paper. I indicate that at times, these related techniques may provide useful entry points to accelerate movement into the gateway experience. 3. Niels Bohr, the renowned physicist, once responded to his son's complaints about the obtuse nature of certain concepts in physics by saying, quote, "You are not thinking, you are merely being logical." The physics of altered human consciousness deals with some conceptualizations that are not easily grasped or visualized exclusively in the context of ordinary, quote, left-brained linear thinking. So, to borrow from Dr. Bohr's mode of expression, parts of this paper will require not only logic, but a touch of awkward page-turning mechanic, right-brain intuitive insight, to achieve a complete, comfortable grasp of the concepts involved. Nevertheless, once that is done, I am confident that their construction and application will stand up to the test of rational critique. And before we finish this kind of introductory point, I think this is really important to establish out of the gate. I mean, there's so much of consciousness that cannot be expressed, as he's saying, simply through the left brain, simply through data and scientific, materialistic terminology. I mean, consciousness itself is a holistic, subjective experience, and it does get inherently philosophical and spiritual, I think, when you wade into this territory. And I think he does a good job throughout the paper, from what I remember, of towing that line and respecting that line. 4. Paradoxically, having gone to such great lengths to avoid trying to render judgments based on an occult or dogmatic frame of reference, in the end I found it necessary to return, at least briefly, to the question of the impact of the gateway experience on common belief systems. I did so because although it was essential to avoid attempting to render an assessment in the context of such systems, I felt that it was necessary after having completed the analysis to point out that the resulting conclusions do not do any violence to the fundamental mainstream extreme of either Eastern or Western belief systems. Unless that point is clearly established, the danger exists that some people will reject the whole concept of the gateway experience in the mistaken belief that it contradicts and is therefore alien to all that they hold to be right and true. This study is certainly not designed to be the last word on the subject, but I hope that the validity of its basic structure and of its fundamental concepts upon which it is based will make it a useful guide for other USA INSCOM personnel who are required to take the gateway training or work within gateway materials. So again, an interesting tidbit pretty much right out of the gate here. It sounds assumed that other USA INSCOM personnel will be undertaking this training, will be undertaking psychical training. All right, here we go. Introduction. In order to describe the Monroe Institute technique for achieving altered states of consciousness, the gateway experience, involving brain hemisphere synchronization or Hemi-Sync, the most effective way to begin is to briefly profile the basic mechanics which underlay the operation of related methods such as hypnosis, transcendental meditation, and biofeedback. It is easiest to effectively describe what gateway is by beginning with a short description of those associated techniques that share some common aspects with the gateway experience, but which are nevertheless different. In this way, we can develop a frame of reference at the outset, which will provide useful concepts to explain and understand gateway by comparison as we proceed. Again, we touch on the importance of philosophy, of lenses, of how to think about what's happening using, other related concepts like what we're about to jump into, hypnosis. According to the theories of psychologist Ronald Stone and the biomedical engineering models of Itzhak Bentov, hypnosis is basically a technique which permits acquisition of different access to the sensory motor cortex and pleasure centers, the lower cerebral emotional portions, and the associated pleasure centers of the right side of the human brain, following successful disengagement of the stimulus screening function of the left hemisphere of the brain. The left hemisphere of the brain is the self-cognitive, verbal, and linear learning component of the mind. It fulfills the function of screening incoming stimuli by categorizing, assessing, and assigning meaning prior to allowing passage into the right hemisphere of the mind. The right hemisphere, which functions as the non-critical, holistic, non-verbal, and pattern-oriented component of the brain, appears to accept what the left hemisphere passes without question. Consequently, if the left hemisphere can be distracted either through boredom or through reduction to a soporific, there's a stretch in my vocabulary with that one, a soporific semi-sleep state, external stimuli to include hypnotic suggestions are allowed to pass unchallenged into the right hemisphere where they are accepted and acted upon directly. The result may involve an emotional reaction originating in the lower cerebral region, sensory motor responses requiring involvement of the cortex, and so on. Both the sensory and the motor cortices of the right cerebral portion of the brain contain a sequence of points known as the homunculus, which corresponds to points in the body. See Exhibit 1 on the next page. Stimulation of the corresponding area of the cortex uses intermediate response to the associated portion of the body. Consequently, induction of the suggestion that the left leg is numb, if it reaches to the right cortex, will result in an electrical reaction being generated that will induce the feeling of numbness. Similarly, the suggestion that the person is experiencing a general feeling of happiness and well-being would be referred to the appropriate pleasure centers located in the lower cerebral portion of the cortex of the right hemisphere, thereby inducing the suggested feeling of euphoria. Finally, suggestions such as one that informs the hypnotic subject that he enjoys enhanced concentration or powers of memory would be responded to the right hemisphere by accessing unused information storage capacity normally held in reserve as a result of the left hemisphere selection and control processes. This aspect will become significant in the context of gateway process when the attention is given to examining the way that hypnosis may be used to accelerate the progress in the early stages of the gateway experience. So this is something I definitely, thought about on my retreat and I've thought about since, is how does the gateway process or the gateway method relate to hypnosis? Like, there's no actual outright suggestion going on as far as I can tell. I truly don't think that there's anything embedded in the Hemi-Sync tapes or CDs or MP3s or whatever form you have them in subliminally. I don't think that's how it works. I do think that there is some other form of suggestion. And I realize that by saying that, that sounds nefarious or underhanded, but I don't think it necessarily is. But we'll get more into this as we go. And now, still under the effort of framing, we'll get into transcendental meditation, and I guess comparing and contrasting that with gateway. On the other hand, transcendental meditation works in a distinctly different fashion. In this technique, intense and protracted single-minded concentration on the process of drawing energy up the spinal cord ultimately results in what appears to be creation of acoustical standing waves in the cerebral ventricles, which are then conducted into the gray matter in the cerebral cortex on the right side of the brain. As a result, according to Bentov, these waves will stimulate and eventually polarize the cortex in such a way that it will tend to conduct a signal along the homunculus, starting from the toes and on up. The Bentov biomedical model, as described in a book by Lee Sanella, MD, entitled Kundalini, Psychosis or Transcendence. Not a book I've read, but has my wonder whiskers perked up. States that the standing acausal waves are a result of the altered rhythm of heart sounds, which are occasioned by prolonged practice of meditation and which set up sympathetic vibrations in the walls of the fluid-filled cavities which comprise the third and lateral ventricles of the brain. In addition, according to Bentov, the states of bliss described by those whose Kundalini symptoms have completed the full loop along the hemispheres may be explained as a self-stimulation of the pleasure centers in the brain caused by the circulation of a, quote, current along the sensory cortex. Bentov also notes that, quote, that most of the described symptoms start on the left side of the body, maybe a typo here, means that it is mostly a development occurring in the right hemisphere, end quote. Although normally a period of meditation involving intense concentration and practice for 5 years or some is required to, quote, bring up the Kundalini, Bentov states that exposure to mechanical or acoustical vibrations in the range of 4 to 7 hertz cycles per second for protracted periods may achieve the same effect. Bentov cites as an example, quote, repeated riding in a car whose suspension and seat combination produce that range of vibrations or being exposed for long periods of time to these frequencies, caused, for instance, by an air conditioning duct. He also notes that, quote, the cumulative effect of these vibrations may be able to trigger a spontaneous physio-kundalini sequence in susceptible people who have particularly sensitive nervous systems. So maybe this is a good moment to pause and reflect on this guy, Itzhak Bentov. I talked about him in the other Gateway video. This guy is like this multidisciplinary polymath who is an absolute genius for sure, but he's not a doctor. In fact, he's really, I think, like I said, an autodidactic philosopher and engineer. He ends up really contributing, from my understanding, to the science of biomedical implants, in particular, like catheter technology. So this is a very smart man with a wide variety of interests, and he really tries to collapse all of those interests down into an overarching theory of reality. And that theory of reality includes everything from very cosmic things like black holes and white holes and quantum theory to very localized biological things to completely psychophysical and spiritual things. I mean, in his book, if you want to get an overview of his whole theory, he has a book called Stalking the Wild Pendulum. We actually read it recently for the Third Eye Drops book club. You're going to find all of the above in there. And it has to do with some pretty familiar topics. I mean, topics like resonance and sound and frequency. But he doesn't just talk about these things in a hand-waving way. He talks about them in a pretty technical way. And this is what a lot of this is hinting at, is that the body responds to different frequencies, and you can achieve different states of consciousness, including expanded states of consciousness, by altering the signals that you're putting into the brain, that you're putting into the whole, biophysical psychomatrix that is the human being. And on that note, we move on to point 4, biofeedback, and how it relates to Gateway. The third consciousness-altering methodology, which will be briefly described as biofeedback. Biofeedback is somewhat unique in that it actually employs the self-cognitive powers of the left hemisphere to gain access to such areas of the right brain as the lower cerebral, motor, and sensory cortices, and assorted pain or pleasure centers. This next sentence is a doozy. Let's give it a rip. Instead of suppressing the left hemisphere, as is done in hypnosis, or largely bypassing and ignoring it, as is done in transcendental meditation, biofeedback teaches the left hemisphere first to visualize the desired result, then to recognize the feelings associated with the experience of successful right hemisphere access to the specific lower cerebral cortex, pain or pleasure, or other areas in the manner needed to produce the desired result. Special self-monitoring devices such as digital thermometer are used to inform the left brain when it succeeds in keying the right hemisphere into accessing the appropriate area. Once this is done, the left hemisphere can then repeatedly instruct the right brain to reestablish the pathways involved so as to produce the same external objective measures of success. In this way, the pathways are strengthened and emphasized to such an extent that the left brain consciousness is enabled to access appropriate areas in the right brain using a conscious demand mode. For example, if the subject wishes to increase the circulation of the left leg in order to speed up healing, he may concentrate with his left brain on achieving that result while carefully monitoring a digital thermometer connected to the left leg. When the concentrated effort begins to achieve success, the digital thermometer will register an increase in the temperature of the left leg. At that point, the subject can mentally, left brain, associate the sensations experienced with the result achieved and can begin to emphasize by memory recall, the same process to cause its strengthening by affirmation and repetition. In this way, pain can be blocked, healing can be enhanced, malignant tumors can apparently be suppressed and ultimately destroyed. The body's pleasure centers can be stimulated, and a variety of specific physiological results may be achieved. In addition, biofeedback may be used to greatly accelerate achievement of deep meditative states, particularly for beginners with no experience in meditative techniques and whose progress in that methodology is enhanced through effective visualization and external objective affirmation. Display of the subject's brainwave patterns on a cathode ray tube has proven to be a laboratory-validated means by which subjects may quickly learn to place themselves in profoundly relaxed states characterized by a sort of quietude and singularity of mental focus associated with advanced meditation. All right, so now we're getting into some territory that I think has a lot to do with what's happening using Gateway, using Hemi-Sync, this biofeedback sort of angle. Clearly, you are creating relationships between states of consciousness and achieving certain things. Of course, when you're doing Gateway, it's not expressly to achieve any physiological effect necessarily, but it is associated with achieving different states of consciousness. You know, these focus levels, focus 10, focus 12. We'll get specifically into those as this goes on, but I think that there is a lot of similarity between what's happening with Gateway, with Hemi-Sync, and the same reason biofeedback works, you know, creating this psychophysical relationship between a stimulus and response. All right, here we go. Gateway and Hemi-Sync 0.5. And by the way, we've got a long way to go, my friends. We're only on page 4. So this is definitely going to have to be in maybe 3 parts. I didn't want to go more than 3 parts, but we'll see. Now that we've briefly profiled the basic mechanics of the principal techniques for altering or expanding consciousness, which share some objectives and or methods employed by the Gateway experience, we may proceed to focus on what that technique actually involves. Fundamentally, the Gateway experience is a training system designed to bring enhanced strength, focus, and coherence to the amplitude and frequency of brainwave output between the left and right hemispheres so as to alter consciousness, moving it outside of the physical sphere so as to ultimately escape even the restrictions of time and space. I'm going to say that again because that's an insane statement right there. Fundamentally, the Gateway experience is a training system designed to bring enhanced strength, focus, and coherence to the amplitude and frequency of brainwave output between the left and right hemispheres so as to alter consciousness, moving it outside the physical sphere so as to ultimately escape even the restrictions of space and time. Crazy. and these run-on sentences are absolutely bonkers, Mr. McDonald. Don't get me wrong. I've loved what you've done, sir. If you're still around, reach out. The participant then gains access to the various levels of intuitive knowledge which the universe offers. What differentiates the gateway experience from forms of meditation is its use of the Hemi-Sync technique, which is defined in a monograph by Monroe Institute trainer Melissa Yeager as a, quote, state of consciousness defined when the EEG patterns of both hemispheres are simultaneously equal in amplitude and frequency, end quote. Although Hemi-Sync seems to be rather rare and of only short duration in ordinary human consciousness, Melissa Yeager states that, quote, audio techniques developed by Bob Monroe can induce and sustain Hemi-Sync with the Institute's basic Focus 3 tapes. She also notes that studies concluded by Elmer and Alice Green at the Menninger Foundation have shown that a subject with 20 years of training in Zen meditation could consistently establish Hemi-Sync at will, sustaining it for over 15 minutes, end quote. Dr. Stuart Twemlow, a psychiatrist and research associate of the Monroe Institute, reports that, quote, in our studies of the effect of the Monroe tape system on brainwaves, we have found that the tapes encourage the focusing of brain energy. It can be measured as with a light bulb in watts into a narrower and narrower frequency band. This focusing of energy is not unlike the yoga concept of one-pointedness, which we may translate in Western terms as single-mindedness. Dr. Twemlow goes on to observe that as the individual gets into the tapes beyond Focus 3, there is a gradual increase in brainwave size, which is a measure of brain energy or power. So this is interesting. When they said Focus 3, I thought maybe they meant like the 3 waves or something. But we never even did Focus 3. We jumped straight into Focus 10, which is the mind awake, body asleep state. So I'm not even sure. I'm going to have to go back and check what Focus 3 is, and I will pop it up on the screen here, some kind of graphic indicating Focus 3. All right, so that is our basic summary of Gateway. And now we're getting into the juice, because we're beginning to talk about achieving states of consciousness in which we can tap into, what did he say? Like the intuitive knowledge that the universe offers. And I mean, we're already bumping up against some questions, right? Like, according to what? According to whom? What did he experience that gave him that knowing? Anyway, now we move on to point 6, lamp versus laser. Melissa Yeager uses a metaphor to help clarify the process involved in using Hemi-Sync in the gateway experience. She points out that the human mind in its natural state may be linked to an ordinary lamp which expands energy in the form of both heat and light, but in a chaotic, incoherent way which diffuses its energy over a wide area of rather limited depth. On the other hand, the human mind under the discipline of Hemi-Sync acts after the fashion of a laser beam, which produces a disciplined stream of light. The stream of energy is projected with total coherence of both frequency and amplitude, such that the surface area of the laser beam contains billions of times the concentrated energy found in a similar surface area on the sun. I gotta read that again. The stream of energy is projected with total coherence of both frequency and amplitude, such that the surface area of a laser beam contains billions of times the concentrated energy found in a similar surface area on the sun. Gateway assumes that once the frequency and amplitude of the human brain are rendered coherent, it is possible to begin accelerating both, so that the human mind is soon resonating at an ever higher vibrational level. The mind can then bring itself into synchronization with more sophisticated and rarefied energy levels in the universe. The mind, when operating at these increasingly rarefied levels, is assumed to be capable of processing the information thus received through the same fundamental matrix by which it makes sense of ordinary physical sensory input to achieve meaning in a cognitive context. Such meaning is usually perceived visually in the form of symbols, but may also be perceived as astonishing flashes of holistic intuition, or even in the form of scenarios involving both visual and aural perceptions. The mechanics by which the mind exercises the consciousness function will be addressed in more detail later in this paper. So now we're getting into some more really intriguing territory. One, the sort of theory behind this, the notion that the more we focus the brain's energy, the more we focus our consciousness on a single pointed, literal, I guess, energy spectrum, the higher states of consciousness we are able to achieve. I really don't understand that point about its relation to the surface of the sun, but that's fascinating. And I guess we're also starting to touch on some of the phenomenology involved here, right? Like he says at the end here, scenarios involving both visual and oral perception, the mechanics by which the mind exercises the consciousness function will be addressed in more detail. So yeah, that was definitely my experience, just sudden visions, basically. So sometimes they would be very brief, sometimes they would be very random. I didn't talk a lot in the video about hearing voices or anything, but now that the topic has come up, I do feel like I do have memories of chatter. And this is something I've experienced too, just on my way in and out of sleep, in hypnagogic and hypnopompic states. I sometimes experience almost this like radio-y chatter. And it's not telling me anything profound. Don't get me wrong. It's mostly like almost just like background noise or something. Drop a comment if this is something you've experienced. All right, frequency following response. To achieve synchronization of brain hemispheres, the Hemi-Sync technique takes advantage of a phenomenon known as the frequency following response, FFR, which means that if the subject hears a sound produced at a frequency which emulates one of those associated with the operation of the human brain, the brain will try to mimic the same frequency pattern by adjusting its brainwave output. Therefore, if the subject is in a fully awake state but hears sound frequencies which approximates the brain output at the theta level, the subject's brain will endeavor to alter the brainwave pattern from the normal beta to the theta level. This is an important point here that we definitely should review when I'm done reading this. Since the theta level is associated with sleep, the subject concerned may progress from a fully awake to sleep state, provided that he does not consciously resist, as the brain strives to entrain its wave frequency output with the one which the person hears. Since these brainwave frequencies are outside the spectrum of sounds which can be heard in pure form by the human ear, Hemi-Sync must produce them based on another phenomenon known as the brain's capacity for deducing, quote, beat frequencies. If the human brain is exposed to one frequency in the left ear, which is 10 hertz below another audible frequency played in the right ear, rather than hearing either of the two audible frequencies, the brain chooses to, quote, hear the difference between them, the, quote, beat frequency, thus availing itself of the FFR phenomenon. And using the technique of the, quote, beat frequencies, the gateway system uses Hemi-Sync and other audio techniques employing the FFR phenomenon to introduce a variety of frequencies which are played at a virtually subliminal, marginally audible level. The objective is to relax the left hemisphere of the brain, place the physical body in a virtual sleep state, and bring the left and right hemispheres into coherence under conditions designed to promote the production of ever higher amplitude and frequency brainwave output. Audible and perhaps subliminal suggestions by Bob Monroe accompany the various brainwave frequencies, which are sometimes rolled in together under sounds such as sea surf to mask the sound frequencies where desirable. In this way, Gateway endeavors to provide the subject with the tools by which he may alter his consciousness based on his own volition over time through repetitive use of the tapes so as to access via intuitive means new categories of information not available to ordinary consciousness. So yeah, this frequency following response is a really important point, a really important part of the theory of how Gateway and also binaural beats in general work. So again, to summarize it, if you want to entrain the brain with a 10 hertz frequency, that is actually not audible. So how do you do that? What you have to do is you create a 10 hertz difference by, say, playing 100 hertz in one ear and then 90 hertz in the other ear, and then using this frequency following response phenomenon of the brain, you are able to entrain your brain with a non-audible brainwave that gets you into a desirable state for meditation, basically. And of course, I was laughing because I said I don't think he's implanting anything subliminal in the tapes, but it sounds like he's readily admitting to that being part of it. And again, I know there's going to be some of you that find that to be nefarious out of the gate, but I spent enough time doing these meditations now that I truly can't detect anything that I would be worried about. Home stretch for this one, my friends. Role of resonance. However, brain coherence through entrainment to, quote, beat frequencies introduced via stereo headphones is only part of the reason why the gateway system works. It is also designed to achieve the physical quietude characteristic of deep transcendental meditative states, which brings about a complete alteration of the fundamental resonance pattern associated with the sound frequencies produced by the human body. Yoga, Zen, or other transcendental meditation, if practiced long enough, will produce a change in the sound frequency with which the human heart resonates throughout the entire body. According to Bentov, this change in resonance results from the elimination of what the medical profession calls the, quote, bifurcation echo, so that the sound of the heartbeat can move synchronously up and down the circulatory system in harmonious resonance approximately 7 times a second. Bentov describes the role played by the bifurcation echo as follows. When the left ventricle of the heart ejects blood, the aorta, being elastic, balloons out just beyond the valve and causes a pressure pulse to travel down along the aorta. When the pressure pulse reaches the bifurcation in the lower abdomen, which is where the aorta forks to go into the 2 legs, part of the pressure pulse rebounds and starts traveling up the aorta. If in the meantime the heart ejects more blood and a new pressure pulse is traveling down, these 2 pressure points, will eventually collide somewhere along the aorta and produce an interference pattern, end quote. By placing the body in a sleep-like state, the gateway tapes achieve the same goal as meditation in that it places the body in such a profoundly relaxed state that the bifurcation echo slowly fades away as the heart lessens the force and frequency with which it pushes blood to the aorta. The result is a regular rhythmic sine wave pattern of sound which echoes throughout the body and rises up into the head in sustained resonance. The amplitude of the sine wave pattern, when measured with a sensitive seismograph type instrument, is about 3 times the average of the sound volume produced by the heart when it is operating normally. So this is something I remember reading in Itzhak Bentov's book, this idea of basically creating coherence throughout the body and eliminating this bifurcation noise, or whatever the bifurcation echo. So again, just to summarize this, by entraining the brain with a binaural signal and going into deep meditation and getting really relaxed, you bring more resonant coherence to the whole body. You eliminate this interference pattern that happens at this bifurcation point in the descending aorta where it splits into the legs, and it creates this resonant pattern. What does he say? That's like 7 times. I'll just read it again. The result is a regular rhythmic sine wave pattern of sound which echoes throughout the body and rises up into the head in a sustained resonance. The amplitude of the sine wave pattern when measured with a sensitive seismograph instrument is about 3 times the average of the sound produced by the heart when it is operating normally. Interesting. You know, I don't know, obviously, how much of this still holds up to modern medical scrutiny, but I would really be interested to know. We're only on page 6. This is a dense document, so it's going to take a while to get through. I think that's a lot to chew on. We've already started bumping up against some really ear-rousing. I mean, that's what binaural beats are, right? Really arousing ontological territory. We've already stated how apparently gateway allows one's consciousness to go beyond space-time, to tap in to the intuitive knowledge of the universe. I think that's pretty close to a direct quote, but there is so much more to come, my friends. We've barely let the juice loose on this topic. If you're enjoying this, you know what to do. Tickle the algorithm, like, sub, comment, share. Picking up where we left off, brain stimulation, point 9 on page 6. Bentov's biomedical model shows that this resonance is of considerable importance since it is directly transmitted to and impacts upon the brain. The resulting vibration is received and transmitted into the brain itself via the fluid-filled third left ventricles located above the brainstem. An electromagnetic pulse is then generated, which stimulates the brain to raise the amplitude and frequency of brainwave output. Just as Dr. Tremlow observed in his research on the effects of the Hemi-Sync tapes, also, the brain is contained in a tight membrane called the dura, which is, in turn, cushioned by a thin layer of fluid located between it and the skull. As the coherent resonance produced by the human heart in a state of profound relaxation reaches the fluid layer surrounding the brain, it sets up a rhythmic pattern in which the brain moves up and down approximately 0.005 to 0.010 millimeters in a continuous pattern. The self-referencing character of resonant behavior accounts for the body's ability to sustain this movement despite the minimal level of energy involved. In this way, the entire body, based on its own micro-motion, functions as a tuned vibrational system, which transfers energy in a range between 6.8 and 7.5 hertz into the Earth's ionospheric cavity, which itself resonates at about 7 to 7.5 hertz. Of this process, Bentov states, quote, "This is occurring at a very long wavelength of about 40,000 kilometers, or just about the perimeter of the planet. In other words, the signal from the movement of our bodies will travel around the world in about 1/7 of a second through the electromagnetic field in which we are embedded. Such a long wavelength knows no obstacles, and its strength does not attenuate much over large distances. Naturally, it will go through just about anything: metal, concrete, water, and the fields making up our bodies. It is the ideal medium for conveying a telepathic signal. Consequently, the gateway process is designed to rather rapidly induce a state of profound calm within the nervous system and to significantly lower blood pressure, to cause the circulatory system, skeleton, and all other physical organ systems to begin vibrating coherently at about 7 to 7.5 cycles per second. The resulting resonance sets up a regular repetitive sound wave which propagates in consonance with the electrostatic field of the Earth." Okay, so once again, this point about brain stimulation, fascinating. I have questions. Seems like a lot of this is based off of speculation. Not that it's not plausible, but... So again, this quote, I'm pretty sure, comes from Stalking the Wild Pendulum by Bentov. It sounds familiar to me. I think in the book he does provide some more evidence for this, but still, this relationship between brainwaves and the electromagnetic field of the Earth is very, very interesting. Don't get me wrong, but I guess I would just love to see more evidence, or if this is something, again, that still holds up to modern scientific scrutiny. All right, point 10, energy entrainment. As the body is turned into a coherent oscillator vibrating in harmony with the surrounding electrostatic medium, the specific exercises included in the gateway tapes enjoin the participant to build up the energy field surrounding the body, presumably by using energy from the Earth's field, which the body is now entraining because of its ability to resonate with it. This puts the body's energy field into homogeneity with the surrounding environment and promotes movement of the seat of consciousness into the surrounding environment, partly in response to the fact that the two electromagnetic mediums are now a single continuum. Thus, the same process which moves the brain into focused coherence at steadily higher levels of frequency and amplitude so as to entrain analogous frequencies in the universe for data collection also promotes enhancement of bodily energy levels to a point adequate to permit the subject to experience an out-of-body movement when he is ready to do so. More will be said about this topic later. In addition, by resonating with the Earth's electromagnetic sphere, the body creates a surprisingly powerful carrier wave to assist the mind in communication activity with other human minds similarly tuned. Again, I come away from this point with similar feelings to point 9. And don't get me wrong, I'm not necessarily questioning anything specifically in terms of like if the method works. I guess I'm just questioning how they jump to these conclusions about the relationship between brainwaves, the electromagnetic field of the Earth, and consciousness. All right, point 11, consciousness and energy. Before our explanation can proceed any further, it is essential to define the mechanism by which the human mind exercises the function known as consciousness, and to describe the way in which that consciousness operates to deduce meaning from the stimuli which it receives. To do this, we will first consider the fundamental character of the material world in which we have our physical existence in order to accurately perceive the raw stuff with which our consciousness must work. The first point which needs to be made is that the two terms, matter and energy, tend to be misleading if taken to indicate two distinctly different states of existence in the physical world that we know. Indeed, if the term matter is taken to mean solid substance as opposed to energy, which is understood to mean a force of some sort, then the use of the former is entirely misleading. Science now knows that both the electrons which spin in the energy field located around the nucleus of the atom and the nucleus itself are made up of nothing more than oscillating energy grids. Solid matter, in the strict construction of the term, simply does not exist. Rather, atomic structure is composed of oscillating energy grids surrounded by other oscillating energy grids which orbit at extraordinarily high speeds. In his book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, Itzhak Bentov gives the following figures. The energy grid which composes the nucleus of the atom vibrates at approximately 10 to the 22nd power hertz, which means 10 followed by 22 zeros. At 70 degrees Fahrenheit, an atom oscillates at the rate of 10 to the 15 hertz. An entire molecule composed of a number of atoms bound together in a single energy field vibrates in the range of 10 to the 9th hertz. A human cell vibrates at approximately 10 to the 3rd power hertz. The point to be made is that the entire human being, brain, consciousness, and all, is like the universe which surrounds him, nothing more or less than an extraordinarily complex system of energy fields. The so-called states of matter are actually variances in the state of energy, and human consciousness is a function of the interaction of energy in two opposite states, motion versus rest, in a manner described in the following paragraph. This makes sense, and this really seems to echo pretty modern theoretical field-based physics, at least from my very high-level understanding. All right, point 12, holograms. Should be a fun one. Energy creates, stores, and retrieves meaning in the universe by projecting or expanding it at certain frequencies in a three-dimensional mode that creates a living pattern called a hologram. The concept of a hologram can be most easily understood by using the example cited by Bentov. Once again, you gotta say that this paper really lives and dies, for better or worse, by Bentov. Anyway, the concept of the hologram can be most easily understood by using an example cited by Bentov, in which he asks the reader to visualize a bowl full of water into which 3 pebbles are dropped. As the ripples created by the simultaneous entry of 3 pebbles radiate outward toward the rim of the bowl, Bentov further asks the reader to visualize that the surface of the water is suddenly flash frozen so that the ripple pattern is preserved instantly. The ice is removed, leaving the 3-dimensional pebbles still laying at the bottom of the bowl. Then the ice is exposed to a powerful coherent source of light such as a laser. The result will be a 3-dimensional model or representation of the position of the 3 pebbles suspended in midair. Holograms are capable of encoding so much detail that, for example, it is possible to take a holographic projection of a glass of swamp water and view it under magnification to see small organisms not visible to the naked eye when the glass of water itself is examined. The whole concept of holography, despite its scientific implications, has only been known to the physicists since the underlying mathematical principles were worked out by Niels Bohr in 1947. He later won a Nobel Prize for his work. Laboratory demonstration of Gabor's work only occurred years later following the invention of the laser. As biologist Lael Watson explains, the purest kind of light available to us is that produced by a laser, which sends out a beam in which all waves are of one frequency, like those made by an ideal pebble in a perfect pond. When 2 laser beams touch, they produce an interference pattern of light and dark ripples that can be recorded by a photographic plate. And if one of the beams, instead of coming directly from the laser, is reflected first off of an object, such as a human face, the resulting pattern will be very complex indeed, but it can still be recorded. The record will be a hologram of the face. So what they're starting to get at here is basically that holograms have this incredible property of a small part of the hologram itself being able to encode the whole. And this is going to have huge implications for the argument this paper is making about consciousness, in that we, in many ways, are a microcosm of the macrocosmic consciousness hologram. All right, so moving on. Point 13. Okay, case in point. Point 13, the part encodes the whole. Of further importance is the fact that even if we dropped our frozen hologram of the ripple pattern on the floor and broke it into a number of pieces, each individual piece would recreate the entire holographic image all by itself. The smaller the piece, the fuzzier and more distorted would be the resulting holographic projection, but the fact remains that the whole projection would nonetheless be made. The key to creating any hologram is that energy in motion must interact with energy in a state of rest, non-motion. In the foregoing example, the pebbles represent energy in motion, while the water, before its agitation by the pebbles, represents energy at a state of rest. To activate, or in effect, to perceive the meaning of a holograph, energy, in this case, a coherent light source such as a laser beam, must be passed through the interference pattern generated by interaction between the moving energy and the energy at rest. In the simple example given by Bentov, this requirement was fulfilled by holding the frozen interference pattern in front of the coherent light to project the three-dimensional holographic image, its, quote, meaning, into space. As Marilyn Ferguson, editor of Brain Mind Bulletin, tells us, quote, another feature of a hologram is its efficiency. Billions of bits of information can be stored in a tiny space. The pattern of the holographic photograph is stored everywhere on the plate. So there you go. Case in point, whole in point of anywhere in the given hologram. Point 4, ooh, here we go. The consciousness matrix. Point 14. The universe is composed of interacting energy fields, some at rest and some in motion. It is, in and of itself, one gigantic hologram of unbelievable complexity. According to the theories of Karl Pribram, a neuroscientist at Stanford University, and David Bohm, a physicist at the University of London, the human mind is also a hologram which attunes itself to the universal hologram by the medium of energy exchange, thereby deducing meaning and achieving the state which we call consciousness. With respect to states of expanded or altered consciousness, such as Gateway uses, the process operates in the following way. As the energy passes through various aspects of the universal hologram and is perceived by the electrostatic fields which comprise the human mind, the holographic images being conveyed are projected upon the electrostatic fields of the mind and are perceived or understood to the extent that the electrostatic field is operating at a frequency and amplitude that can harmonize with and therefore read the energy carrier wave pattern passing through it. Changes in the frequency and amplitude of the electrostatic field which comprises the human mind determines the configuration and hence the character of the holographic energy matrix, which the mind projects to intercept meaning directly from the holographic transmissions of the universe. Then, to make sense of what the holographic image is saying to it, the mind proceeds to compare the image just received with itself. Specifically, it does this by comparing the image received with that part of its own hologram which constitutes memory, by registering differences in geometric form and in energy frequency. The consciousness perceives, see Exhibit 2 on the next page, as psychologist Keith Floyd puts it, contrary to what everyone knows is so, it may not be the brain that produces consciousness, but rather consciousness that creates the appearance of the brain. So I think this point is really of the utmost importance. And now, this figure on the next page is one of, if not the most famous images from this whole report. But yeah, this point that we just ended on here, it's consciousness that produces the appearance of the brain, not the brain that produces consciousness. That in and of itself is a really huge point. But this whole concept of consciousness of the individual being like a fractured piece of the hologram of the whole is a really huge point. And then if we make that assumption, this idea that if you perturb the consciousness field of the human being with a different frequency, like Gateway does, you can therefore change its perception, you can change its level of consciousness, you can expand its consciousness, you can tune it in to different frequencies of reality or different energy systems, probably, as Robert Monroe would like to say. All right, point 15, brain in phase. The consciousness process is most easily envisaged if we picture the holographic input with a three-dimensional grid system superimposed over it in such that all of the energy patterns contained within it can be described in terms of three-dimensional geometry using mathematics to reduce the data to a two-dimensional form. Bentov states that the scientists suspect that the human mind operates on a simple binary go-no-go system, as do all digital computers. Therefore, once it superimposes a three-dimensional matrix over holographic information it wishes to interpret and reduces that information mathematically to two-dimensional form, it can completely process it using its fundamental binary system, just as any computer made by the hand of man can process volumes of data and make various comparisons between the data and information stored in its digital memory. Our minds operate in the same way, perceiving by comparison only. Bentov states the proposition this way, quote, "Our whole reality is constructed by constantly making such comparisons. Whenever we perceive something, we always perceive differences only. In states of expanded consciousness, the right hemisphere of the human brain, in its holistic, nonlinear, and nonverbal mode of functioning, acts as the primary matrix receptor for this holographic input while operating in phase or coherence with the right brain. The left hemisphere provides the secondary matrix through its binary computer-like method of functioning to screen further the data by comparison and reduce it to a discrete two-dimensional form." I'm not too sure what to think about this part about the brain operating in a similar way to binary with the go, no-go kind of analogy. I don't think it's super important to the central philosophy of the paper. Maybe I just need to chew this one over more, but anyway, that is my knee-jerk. Moving on to 16, evaluation. To the extent that Gateway succeeds in bringing about a reinforcement in energy matrix of the mind, it succeeds by expanding or altering human consciousness so that it can perceive without recourse to the intercession of the physical senses, such that ever more of the universal hologram, not, of course, accessible by sense perception, can ultimately be perceived and understood. Marilyn Ferguson has written that the theories of Pribram and Bohm appear to account for all transcendental experience, paranormal events, and even, quote, normal perceptual oddities. She goes on to say of Pribram, quote, "Currently, he is proposing a startling, all-encompassing model that is generating considerable excitement among those intrigued by the mysteries of human consciousness. His, quote, holographic model marries brain research to theoretical physics. It accounts for normal perception and simultaneously takes paranormal and transcendental experiences out of the supernatural by explaining them as part of nature. Like certain strange discoveries of quantum physics, the radical reorientation of this theory suddenly makes sense of paradoxical sayings of mystics throughout the ages." Yeah, this does make sense to me. And again, this sort of harmonizes with a trend I see among a lot of philosophers of consciousness, like people like Bernardo Kastrup, people like Dr. Donald Hoffman, even John Vervaeke, that there is nothing supernatural about expanded states of consciousness or consciousness, but at the same time, consciousness itself cannot be explained in merely classical physics, materialistic terms, because there are these like anomalous features of consciousness and perception in the human experience that just can't be reduced down to a physicalist framework. So then what they do is they expand the horizon of what is considered natural, which, it makes a lot of sense. Like if you're dealing with a scientific system that accounts for something like quantum physics, considers something like the holographic universe, and that consciousness is a part of that universal hologram, you don't need anything supernatural because you have sufficient notions and theories to put consciousness in a lens that is, natural, at least by those terms. All right, 17, self-cognition. To complete our outline of the process by which the mind achieves and exercises consciousness, we must also describe the mechanism which accounts for the aspect of human thought that differentiates it from consciousness of plants and animals. i.e. self-cognition. Humans not only know, but they know that they know. They are able to monitor the process of their own thinking and maintain awareness of it. Moreover, they can conduct a comparative assessment evaluating the functioning of their thought processes against various objective standards they have adopted. Human consciousness can do this because it has the capacity to duplicate aspects of its own hologram, project them out, perceive that projection, put it through comparison with the memory aspect, where its evaluation standards of measure are stored, of its own hologram, and measure or sense the differences using three-dimensional geometry, and then binary go, no-go pulse to yield verbal cognition about the self. Tempted to use the phrase word salad there, but I don't think it's nonsense. I don't think what he's saying is nonsense, but it's just another one of these classic run-on sentences that is just clunky to read and fully grok on the first go through. But yeah, I mean, how can you not agree with the idea that there's something, I don't want to like diminish other kinds of intelligence, because I think as humans we have a tendency to want to do that, but clearly there is something different about human consciousness, right? And we do have this ability that he's talking about to essentially project, create our own, if you want to call it, holograms or creations, and consider those and weigh them philosophically. Like think about something very practical like art, let's say. That is a kind of meaning human beings are capable of producing and reflecting upon in a way that is very central to what we are as creatures. All right, point 18, time-space dimension. Up to this point, you're going to love this part. Up to this point, our discussion of the gateway process has been relatively simple and easy to follow. But now the fun begins. Gateway involves more than just perception of those aspects of the universal hologram which can be accessed in the dimension of time-space as we know it. To explain how and why human consciousness can be brought to transcend the limitations of time-space is the next task which must be addressed. To do this, we must first appreciate what time and space are in order to understand how the dimension that they constitute can be transcended. Physicists define time as a measurement of energy or force in motion. In other words, it is a measurement of change. However, in order for energy to be in motion, it must first be limited in some way within the confines of some sort of vibratory pattern, so that its confinement gives it the capacity for being contained at a specific location, which is distinguishable from other locations, space. Energy, which is not confined, is force without limit, without dimension, without limits of form. It is infinity, cannot move because there is nothing beyond infinity, and is therefore outside the dimension of time. It is also beyond space because that concept implies that a specific energy form is limited to a specific location and is absent from other locations. But if energy is in the state of infinity, there are no boundaries, no here to differentiate from there, no sense of area. Energy in infinity means energy uniformly extended without limit. It has no beginning, no end, no location. It is conscious force, the fundamental primal power of existence without form, a state of infinite being. Energy in infinity is said to be completely at rest and therefore cannot generate holograms so long as it remains utterly inactive. It contains its inherent capacity for consciousness in that it can receive and passively perceive holograms generated by energy in motion out in the various dimensions which make up the created universe, but it cannot be perceived by consciousness operating in the active universe. Energy in this state of inactive infinity is termed by physicists as energy in its absolute state, or simply, quote, the absolute. Between the absolute and the material universe in which we experience our physical existence are various intervening dimensions to which human consciousness in altered states of being may gain access. Theoretically, human consciousness may continue to expand the horizons of its perceptual capacity until it reaches the dimension of the absolute, at which point perception stops because the absolute generates no holograms of or about itself. So some pretty key ideas here, I would say, in this point about the time-space dimension. Obviously we're just defining generally what time and space are, but we're also putting out, I guess, the sort of hypothesis that consciousness itself really is always part of this equation, whether if it's in a differentiated holographic form, as we're talking about here, in that consciousness instantiates itself in an absolute universe worth of a panoply of ways, but its ultimate state is unified and at rest in the form of the absolute, and that we as human beings have the ability to perceive just a multitude of states between here and the absolute. And I mean, this really harmonizes with the world's spiritual traditions, particularly of the mystical flavor, right? In other words, the idea that we're all one, that underlying all of the apparent diversity, there is this absolute or this one or this unified mystery that we're all derivative of, or that we somehow differentiated out of. All right, 19, intervening dimensions. Since the absolute is conscious energy in infinity, i.e. without boundaries, it occupies every dimension to include the time-space dimension in which we have our physical existence, but we cannot perceive it. It overlays everything, as do many of the intervening gradients or dimensions, through which the energies of the universe pass on their way to and from their home in the state of infinity or the absolute. To enter these intervening dimensions, human consciousness must focus with such intense coherence that the frequency of the energy pattern, which comprises that consciousness, i.e. the brainwave output, can accelerate to a point where the resulting frequency pattern, if displayed on an oscilloscope, would look virtually like a solid line. Achievement of this state of altered consciousness sets the stage for perception of non-space-time dimensions because of the operation of a principle in physics known as Planck's distance. This is an aspect of quantum mechanics which applies to the fact that any oscillating frequency, such as a brainwave, reaches 2 points of complete rest which constitute the boundaries of each individual's oscillation, i.e. movement up or down. Without these points of rest, an oscillating wave pattern would be impossible, since the points of rest are required to permit the energy to change direction and thus continue vibrating between rigid limits. But it is also true that when, for an infinitesimally brief instant, that energy reaches one of its 2 points of rest and, quote, clicks out of time-space and joins infinity. See Exhibit 3, next page. That critical step out of space-time occurs when the speed of the oscillation drops below 10 to the 33 centimeters per second, Planck's distance. To use the words of Bentov, quote, quantum mechanics tells us that when distances go below Planck's distance, which is 10 to the negative 33 centimeters, we enter in effect a new world, end quote. To return to our case in point, the human consciousness wave reaches such high frequency that the pattern of clickouts comes so close together that there is virtual continuity in it. Then a portion of that consciousness is actually postulated to establish and maintain its information collection function in those dimensions located between time, space, and the absolute. Thus, the almost continuous clickout pattern establishes itself in continuous phase at speeds below Planck's distance. But before reaching the state of total rest, human consciousness passes through the looking glass of time-space after the fashion of Alice beginning her journey into Wonderland. Wow. The gateway experience, with its associated Hemi-Sync technique, is apparently designed, if used systematically and patiently, to enable human consciousness to establish a coherent pattern of perception in those dimensions where speeds below Planck's distance apply. This holds true irrespective of whether the individual is exercising his consciousness while in his physical body, or whether he is doing so after having separated that consciousness from the physical body, i.e. the so-called out-of-body state mentioned earlier. Okay, so this is more esoteric, but this is really huge, and I'm going to have to think about this because this notion of clicking out, we would use this phrase all the time at the retreat to refer to when you're doing a Hemi-Sync meditation and you just like lose consciousness suddenly. When I talked about this in the other video, so I won't go on at length about this, but at first I really considered that to be just falling asleep during a meditation. But the phenomenology of clicking out versus falling asleep is different. And the more you ride the line between, metacognating, being self-aware, like understanding, okay, I am Michael, I am meditating, and then just suddenly losing awareness, and then you come back into, in my case, my Michaelness, the more you go in and out of those states, it's almost like you start to wear the line down or something. Like you start to become more aware in the quote unquote clicked out state. And if I'm reading this correctly, it sounds like that's part of the point, that you gradually be able to come aware of these expanded states of consciousness that are like clicked out, that are beyond space-time. So this is really interesting. I'm probably going to reread or re-listen to myself read, as cringe as that is, that part a couple of times. All right, subatomic particles. The behavior of subatomic particles provides an interesting example of the phenomenon of clicking out discussed in the preceding paragraphs. In an article prepared for Science Digest magazine, Dr. John Gliedman? I hope glide sounds better than gleed. Mentions the way in which subatomic particles communicate with each other once their energy fields become entrained as a result of colliding with each other. The communication concerned is, of course, postulated to be occurring during the, quote, click-out phase, in the oscillation of energy forms comprising the subatomic particles concerned. It is this cause which accounts for the cross-communication at what in terms of space-time velocities would seem to include speeds in excess of light. In reality, Einstein's theory of relativity is not being invalidated, but rather the communication concerned is taking place outside the dimension of time-space to which the theory of relativity is strictly confined. Specifically, Dr. Gliedman tells us, quote, quantum theory postulates a kind of long-range Siamese twin effect whenever two subatomic particles collide and then go their different ways. Even when the particles are halfway across the universe from each other, it says they instantaneously respond to each other's actions. And in doing so, they violate relativity's ban on faster than light velocities. Indeed, regarding attempts to quantify what is known as the behavior of energy in dimensions apparently outside of time-space, Bentov speaks about, quote, courageous physicists who are working on the hypothetical particles called, quote, tachyons, which move at speeds higher than light. The speed of tachyons starts just above the speed of light and ranges all the way to infinite velocities. So I don't know a lot about tachyons. I've heard of them. But yeah, I mean, they're really talking about one of the core pieces of phenomena that occurs in quantum physics, right? The spooky action at a distance, as Einstein called it, entanglement. It really is like this is something that's taking place in a dimension that is completely behind time and space, the quantum dimension where time and space and distance and all of these things just don't apply. And this is why you hear the term, quantum non-locality all the time, because there are these states in which reality, or at least subatomic particles, can just completely transcend the rules of relativity. Like, cause and effect doesn't apply. Transmission of information, like when you have two particles that are entangled, right? And they allude to this here, and you shoot those two particles in opposite directions, it doesn't matter how far apart those particles are. If you measure one particle, the particle that it's entangled with will instantaneously take on an opposite value. So like if you measure one particle and its spin is up, instantaneously at that exact moment that you measure its partner, the other particle's spin is down. And this isn't about violating Einstein's relativity. There is no information transfer occurring between those two particles. It's just a feature of the weirdness of quantum theory. I did a video on this a long time ago when some physicists won the Nobel Prize for breakthroughs in quantum theory. If you want to check it out, I will link it. Now that we've postulated the legitimacy of the assertion that the energy forms which compose consciousness can move beyond the time-space dimension, we need to turn our attention to the energy forms which inhabit those dimensions between time, space, and the absolute. In doing so, we may better perceive the form that reality assumes when we encounter it in those intermediate dimensions. In this context, Bentov tells us that, quote, the causal relationship between events breaks down. Movements become jerky rather than smooth. Time and space become grainy or chunky. Perhaps a piece of space can be traversed by a particle of matter in any direction without necessarily being synchronized with a piece of time. In short, a pair of events will occur in either time or space, the pair not being connected causally, but by a random fluctuation. What Bentov means is that inside the dimension of time-space, both concepts apply in a generally uniform way. There is a proportional relationship between them. A certain space can be covered by energy moving in either particle or waveform in a certain time, assuming a specific velocity virtually anywhere in the time-space universe. The relationship is neat and predictable. However, in the intermediate dimensions beyond time and space, the limitations imposed on energy to put it into a state of oscillating motion are not uniform as they are in our physical universe. A myriad of various distortions and incongruities are thus likely to be encountered, such that our nice, neat assumptions concerning the relationship between time and space, as we now know it in this dimension, do not apply. But even more important, access is opened to both the past and the future when the dimension of current time-space is left behind. So yeah, again, this idea that all of our assumptions about reality, time and space, cause and effect, the way things in this physical layer of reality have to happen in a linear, like I said, cause and effect kind of way, just don't apply at some levels of reality, in some, I don't know if dimensions is the right word, but planes of existence. All right, 22, special status, out-of-body experience. Here we go. Although human consciousness can, with enough practice, move beyond the dimension of time and space and interface with other energy systems in other dimensions, the entire process is appreciably enhanced if that consciousness can be detached in large measure from the physical body before such interface is attempted. Once an individual becomes proficient in the technique of out-of-body movement and then reaches the point where he is able to break out of the time-space while out of his body, he gains the advantage of, quote, clicking out part of his enhanced consciousness while starting from a base located much closer to the dimensions with which he wishes to communicate. In other words, since he is starting from a point much, quote, higher up, to use an analogy from the time-space context, that part of his consciousness involved in clicking out will have much more time to interact with dimensions beyond time-space because less time is required to traverse intervening layers. Moreover, once the individual is able to project his consciousness beyond time-space, that consciousness would logically tend to entrain its frequency output with the new energy environment to which it is exposed, therein greatly enhancing the extent to which the individual's altered consciousness may be further modified to achieve a much heightened point of focus and a much refined oscillating pattern. As a result, a self-reinforcing process should ensue whereby the farther consciousness in the out-of-body state can be projected beyond the time-space dimension, the more its level of energy output would be enhanced, thus promoting the potential for still further travel. The tentative conclusion to be drawn is that the out-of-body state may be regarded as an extremely effective way of accelerating the process of enhancing consciousness and of interfacing with dimensions beyond time-space. If the practitioner of the gateway technique has a choice of concentrating on achieving and exploiting the out-of-body experience as opposed to concentrating his full efforts on expanding his consciousness exclusively from a physical base, the former would appear to promise much faster, much more impressive successes than does the latter. I will forever be in awe of these run-on angular sentences of our dear friend Lieutenant Colonel McDonnell here. But what he's saying is, to sum it up, being able to achieve the out-of-body state, being able to temporarily liberate yourself from your meat suit will allow your consciousness to achieve connections with these other energy systems or dimensions or, intermediary planes of reality between here and the absolute much more easily. Covering some good ground here. We've got a couple of pages of art, of figures coming up as well, so I think we might be getting close to a good stopping point, but we will continue. All right, point 22, absolute in perspective. It may be helpful at this point to pause and recap the major aspects of our intellectual journey from time-space to the realm of the absolute. It's crazy because I talk for so long during podcasts, but reading like this is just absolute murder on your voice by comparison, I think, because you just never stop. So yes, we will conclude soon. But anyway, we have spoken at some length concerning the incredibly complex hologram which is created by the intercession of energy patterns generated by the totality of all dimensions of the universe, time-space included. We have noted that our minds constitute energy fields which interact with various aspects of this hologram to deduce the information which is ultimately processed through the left hemisphere of our brains to reduce it to a form that we employ for the processes we call thinking. We have implied that this hologram is the infinite embodiment in active energy form of the infinite consciousness of the absolute. It is the title we assign to that vast pool of energy in a state of perfect rest over which the physical universe is layered, and from whence it comes. Incidentally, Bentov uses the analogy of a very deep sea, comparing the still depths of the sea to the dimension of the absolute, while assigning the storm-tossed waves above to represent the physical universe with which we are familiar. The slightly agitated currents of the sea to be found in between the turbulent surface and the totally still depths represent energy in the process of either going into rest, i.e. approaching infinity, or coming out of rest. All right, I like that. Nice little dip into the sea analogy. It's all one ocean of consciousness. There are the depths that are completely at rest. Those depths are akin to the absolute. We in our physical world are akin to the surface of the ocean with all kinds of waves forming and dissolving and coming and going. From Big Bang to Taurus 24. Working from the widely accepted Big Bang theory, Bentov presents a conceptual model to depict the process of time-space evolution, the relative position of the universal hologram. That hologram is often called a torus because it is thought to have the overall shape of an immense self-contained spiral. Basing his thesis on recent studies concerning the distribution of quasars, quasi-stellar objects, and operating on the premise that in the universe, smaller processes tend to mirror images of larger ones, i.e. the pattern of electrons around the nucleus of an atom mirrors the way planets orbit their suns, and so on, Bentov postulates the following scenario. Taking his cue from the observed compatibility of quasars to eject enormously concentrated beams of matter from their interiors in a controlled, non-concentric version of the, quote, Big Bang, he envisages a similar process occurring in the generation of the universe. See Exhibit 4 on the next page. Noting that those galaxies located to the north of our own galaxy are moving away faster than those located to the south, and that those to the east and west are demonstrably more distant. Bentov regards this as substantive evidence that the jet of matter which expanded into our universe has turned back upon itself, eventually forming an ovoid or egg shape. He sees matter in our universe entering the ovoid pattern following ejection from a nucleus composed of extremely compressed energy through a, quote, white hole. At the end of its trip to the far end of the ovoid, he sees it departing via a black hole. In such a model, time is observed to be the measure of the change which occurs as energy evolves into new, more complex forms as it progresses along the distance from the white hole side of the nucleus around the shell of this cosmic egg until it enters the black hole. In other words, as energy expelled from infinity and confined within limits by the conscious of the absolute achieves form and motion following ejection from the white hole at the top of the egg. Time begins as a measure of the cadence of this evolutionary movement as reality goes around the shell of the egg on its journey to the black hole at the far end. So again, straight out of Stalking the Wild Pendulum, this notion that the universe itself is in this sort of state of flux, of coming and going, this meta egg that is ever flowing from white hole to black hole in some kind of, cosmic reincarnation pattern, as depicted in this amazing image that you've probably seen many times at this point if you're interested in this document. Okay, we're going to wrap this with point 25, our place in time. The observed distribution of galaxies suggests that our particular universe is located near the top of the egg at the point where matter begins to fall back on itself, thus explaining the reason why the galaxies to the north are seen to be moving away more rapidly as they are caught up in the downturn of the stream of matter toward the far end of the cosmic egg. See Exhibit 5 on the next page. Layered over this cosmic egg is the absolute, which sustains the radiating nucleus from which the original jet of matter issued forth. As the stream of matter moves around the ovoid toward its destination at the black hole, where it will be reabsorbed into the radiating nucleus and then the absolute, it generates the interference pattern within the cosmic egg, which constitutes the universal hologram or torus. Since the torus is being simultaneously generated by matter in all the various phases of time, it reflects the development of the universe in the past, present, and future, as it would be seen from our particular perspective in one phase of time. By reflecting on this model, it becomes possible to see how human consciousness brought to a sufficiently altered or focused state could obtain information concerning the past, present, and future, since they all exist in the universal hologram simultaneously. In the case of the future, because all of the consequences of the past and present can be seen coming together in the hologram, such that the future can be predicted or seen with total accuracy. Quite a statement. Moreover, it is possible to see how the implosion of energy patterns would cross and recross to create an incredibly complex four-dimensional hologram or torus in spiral shape, in reflection of the multidimensional developing pattern of evolution. All of the movements of the energies which comprise the universe leave their mark and hence tell their story throughout time. All right, friends, commencing the third and final parts of this full read-through of the Gateway Process document, starting with point 26, quality of consciousness. We noted earlier that the out-of-body state involves projection of a major portion of the energy pattern that represents human consciousness so that it may move either freely throughout the terrestrial sphere for purposes of information acquisition or into other dimensions outside of space-time, perhaps to interact with other forms of consciousness within the universe. Consciousness is the organizing and sustaining principle that provides the impetus and guidance to bring and keep energy in motion within a given set of parameters so that a specific reality will result. When consciousness reaches a state of sophistication in which it can perceive itself, its own hologram, it reaches the point of self-cognition. Human beings have this form of elevated consciousness, as does the absolute, but in case of the latter, it is a function of energy and its associated quality of consciousness in infinity, omniscience and omnipotence in perceptual unity. When energy returns to a state of total rest within the absolute, it returns to the continuum of consciousness in the pool of limitless, timeless perception that resides there. Thus, the more complex an energy system in the material state, the more consciousness it possesses to maintain its reality. Our consciousness, therefore, is that differentiated aspect of the universal consciousness which resides within the absolute. It accounts for the organization of the energy patterns which constitute our physical body, but it is distinctly separate from and superior to it, since consciousness exists quite apart from and outside of reality, beyond the bounds of time-space. It is like the absolute. It, like the absolute, has neither beginning nor end. Reality has both a beginning and an end because it is bounded within time-space, but the fundamental quantum energy and its associated consciousness is eternal. When reality ends, its constituent energy simply returns to infinity and the absolute. Fascinating stuff. Again, I have questions about this relationship between human consciousness and the absolute, but you still see this notion in really cutting edge ideas in the sort of philosophy of consciousness, right? That there is this aspect of human consciousness that is not bound by space-time, that is immortal, that exists outside the confines of space-time. I mean, these are all ideas that you'll find in, like I said, really cutting edge physics of consciousness thinkers. Again, Dr. Donald Hoffman, Bernardo Kastrup, Federico Fagin, they all have some version of this, that, you know, these rules, this world that we live in is not the absolute reality, or at least consciousness is not bound to that reality. Like in the case of somebody like Federico Fagin, he has this notion that human consciousness is both quantum and classical, that there is this immortal part of our consciousness that resides outside of space-time, just like they're saying in this paper. So, interesting stuff. Okay, point 27, consciousness in perspective. Having ascertained that human consciousness is able to separate from physical reality and interact with other intelligences in other dimensions within the universe, and that it is both eternal and destined for ultimate return to the absolute, we are faced with a question. So what happens then? Since memory is a function of consciousness and therefore enjoys the same eternal character as the consciousness which accounts for its existence, it must be admitted that when consciousness returns to the absolute, it brings with it all the memories it has accumulated through experience in reality. The return of consciousness to the absolute does not imply an extinction of the separate entity which the consciousness organized and sustained in reality. Rather, it suggests differentiated consciousness which merges with and participates in the universal consciousness and infinity of the absolute without losing the separate identity and accumulated self-knowledge which its memories confer upon it. What it does lose is the capability for generation of independent thought holograms, since that can be done only by energy in motion. In other words, it retains the power to perceive, but loses the power of will or choice. In exchange, however, this consciousness participates in the all-knowing infinite continuum of consciousness, which is a characteristic of energy in the ever-present. Consequently, it is accurate to observe that when a person experiences the out-of-body state, he is in fact projecting that eternal spark of consciousness and memory which constitutes the ultimate form of his identity, to let it play in and learn from dimensions both inside and outside the time-space world in which his physical component currently enjoys a short period of reality. Fascinating stuff. Again, you know, there's definitely overlaps with a lot of ancient esoteric and spiritual traditions here, but I'm really curious, you know, how they came to this conclusion about really the ultimate fate of the human's immortal consciousness, right? That it will somehow preserve a sense of individuality, yet also merge with the absolute, you know, with the immortal consciousness hologram that underlies reality. I mean, I'm not mad at it. I like it, but I do have questions. I mean, it's really reminiscent of some of the Platonic and Hermetic ideas, right? Like in the really both Hermetic and Platonic traditions, there's this idea that, you know, human consciousness can be reborn into the nous, you know, the divine mind or the logos. So yeah, hard not to think about that here. All right, 28. Now we're going to start getting into slowly and surely the methodology in and of itself. So 28, gateway method. Having put the gateway experience in context by postulating a structural outline of how and why it seems to work, and having shown what it is designed to achieve, the time has come to examine the specific techniques which comprise the gateway process. These techniques are designed to enable the user of the gateway tapes to manipulate the high energy states, which can be achieved if the user continues to work with the tapes over a period of time. The amount of time required to reach advanced energy states and to fully exploit all the techniques varies with the individual. The sensitivity of his nervous system, his general state of mind, and the extent to which he may have previously developed facility in related techniques such as transcendental meditation are all pertinent factors affecting the speed at which he may expect to progress. The gateway process begins by teaching the individual participant to isolate extraneous concerns in a visualization device called an energy conversion box. Next, the participant is introduced to a method of encouraging his mind and body to strive to achieve a state of resonance through utterance of a single tone, a monotonous, contracted humming sound that sets up a feeling of vibration, particularly in the head. He engages in this resonant tuning, as it is called, by humming along with a chorus of such sounds that are contained on the gateway tape. Following this, the participant is exposed to the gateway affirmation and is encouraged to repeat it to himself as he hears it repeated on the tape. This affirmation is a statement to the effect that the individual realizes that he is more than merely his physical body and that he deeply desires to expand his consciousness. Yeah, this is interesting. So this is essentially, again, it's an outline of one of the very first things you do when you're doing the gateway method. And really you do this every time. You use this energy conversion box method, which is like, you put anything you don't want to bring with you into the meditation, your fears, your anxieties, whatever it is, you really visualize putting those things in the box and leaving them there so they don't interfere with your meditation. Then you do this resonant tuning, which is, imagine it's like chanting, but you're not saying anything. You're just like following along with these like, oh, kind of intonations on the tape. And then the final part is this affirmation, saying like, I'm more than my physical body. And because I am more than my physical body, I can explore non-physical states, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that's pretty much exactly what you learn in the retreat as well. Hemi-Sync introduced, 29. After that, he is exposed for the first time to the Hemi-Sync sound frequencies and is encouraged to focus on and develop a perception of and appreciation for those feelings which accompany the synchronization of brainwaves that results. Next comes the technique of progressive and systematic physical relaxation, while the Hemi-Sync frequencies are expanded to include additional forms of pink and white noise designed to put the physical body at a virtual threshold of sleep, as well as to calm the left hemisphere of the mind while raising the right hemisphere to a state of heightened attentiveness. Once all of this is achieved, the participant is invited to envisage the creation of a, quote, energy balloon comprised of an energy flow beginning at the center of the top of the head and extending down in all directions to the feet. The energy involved in this flow then proceeds up through the body and back into the balloon pattern again. The energy balloon, which sets up a pattern very reminiscent of the cosmic egg discussed earlier, not only enhances bodily energy flow and encourages early achievement of a suitable resonance state, but it is also designed to provide protection against conscious entities possessing lower energy levels, which the participant might encounter in the event that he achieves an out-of-body state. It serves as a precautionary purpose in the unlikely event that the participant's first out-of-body experience involves direct projection outside the terrestrial sphere. Interesting. So, again, all of these things are parts of what you learn at the Gateway Retreat, except I don't recall them specifically ever discussing. So let me back up. You definitely do this resonant energy balloon practice, just like those other things that you do at the beginning of every meditation. But they never specifically say that this is like a protective bubble necessarily. So that's interesting. And yeah, it really makes me think of my own experience with, surprisingly, going out of body. But anyway, yeah, I'll put a pin in that there. All right, 30 advanced techniques. Having achieved focus 10, the participant is now ready to endeavor to achieve a state of sufficiently expanded awareness to begin actually interacting with dimensions beyond those associated with his experience of physical reality. This state is called Focus 12 and involves conscious efforts on his part, while additional forms of pink and white noise enter the sound stream being directed into his ears from the gateway tape. Once the participant has achieved this state of greatly expanded awareness, he is ready to begin employing a series of specific techniques or tools, as the Monroe Institute characterizes them, which enable him to manipulate his newly found expanded awareness to obtain practical, useful feedback of value for promoting self-discovery and personal growth. The specific techniques involved are described individually below. So let's reflect on this really quick, because now they're introducing this idea of focus levels, and they do specifically cover focus levels later. Specifically, Focus 15 and Focus 21 have their own kind of bullet points, but it seems like they sort of skip over explaining what focus 10 is. They just mention it. So that's the first primary focus level that you work with when you do these tapes. Focus 10 is called the mind awake, body asleep state. And that's really what it feels like. And then as they say here, focus 12 is supposed to be expanded awareness. It's supposed to get you into this state where, like it says, you can begin to work with other energy systems. I'm going to be blunt and say that to me, that's kind of nebulous as a practitioner. Am I a super advanced gateway practitioner? I guess not. You know, I did do a gateway retreat where we did dozens of meditations. We spent a lot of time in focus 12 relatively. But to me, that state largely feels like there's this energetic rushing throughout the body. And yes, there are some, things encountered in the mind's eye. So maybe that's what they mean by encountering other energy systems. And if you're interested in more on specifically what I experienced in the video that I've been plugging at the beginning of all of these read-throughs, I do have this sort of journal entry type shares that I was doing during the retreat, in which I get into the specifics of what I experienced. All right, 30A now, problem solving. This technique involves identifying fundamental problems which the individual wishes to see solved, fulfilling his expanded awareness with his perception of these problems, and then projecting them out into the universe. In this way, the individual enlists the assistance of what Monroe calls his, quote, higher self, in other words, his expanded consciousness, to interact with the universal hologram to obtain the information required to solve the problem. This approach may be used to solve personal difficulties, technical problems in the realm of physics, mathematics, etc., practical administrative problems, and so on. Responses to the problem-solving technique may be received almost immediately, but often they come based on developing intuition over the next 2 to 3 days. Frequently, the response comes in the form of a sudden holistic perception in which the individual suddenly finds that he simply knows the answer in all of its ramifications and completely in context, sometimes without even being able to put his newly found perception into words, at least initially. In some cases, the response may even arrive in the form of visual symbols, which the individual will, quote, see with his mind while he is in the focus 12 state, and which he will have to interpret after he returns to normal consciousness. So this is interesting, and as I was reading this kind of just occurred to me. I don't feel like we specifically did this too much at the retreat, but then again, we did enter into certain meditations with questions or things we were interested in exploring, so I think that's what this is alluding to here, but we didn't specifically, from my memory, get into this idea of interacting with the higher self in this way. I know they do other, more advanced retreats that seem to be more oriented toward connecting with the higher self or connecting with your guidance, which I'm very intrigued in and would really like to do one of those retreats, by the way. So yeah, more than I would like to explore on this point. All right, patterning. This technique involves the use of consciousness to achieve desired objectives in the physical, emotional, or intellectual sphere. It involves concentration on the desired objective while in a focus 12 state. Extension of the individual's perception of that objective into the whole expanded consciousness and its projection into the universe with the intention that the desired objective is already a matter of established achievement, which is destined to be realized within the time frame specified. This particular methodology is based on the belief that the thought patterns generated by our consciousness in a state of expanded awareness create holograms, which represent the situation we desire to bring to an end. Bring about, and in so doing, establish the basis for actual realization of that goal. Once the thought-generated hologram of the sought-after objective is established in the universe, it becomes an aspect of reality which interacts with the universal hologram to bring about the destined objective, which might not, under other circumstances, ever occur. In other words, the technique of patterning recognizes the fact that since consciousness is the source of all reality, our thoughts have the power to influence the development of reality in space-time as it applies to us if those thoughts can be projected with adequate intensity. However, the more complicated the objective sought and the more radically it departs from our current reality, the more time the universal hologram will need to reorient our reality sphere to accommodate our desires. Monroe trainers caution against attempting to force the pace of this process because the individual could succeed in dislocating his existing reality with drastic consequences. We did do a patterning exercise at my retreat. It's very similar to the more kind of modern idea of manifestation. I think there are some important differences. Viewers of the channel may have sort of intuited that. I don't think it's a stretch to say that I have a distaste for manifestation in a lot of its forms. You know, it can kind of take on this vapid sort of materialistic connotation a lot of the time. And I guess that's on an individual by individual basis. And maybe I'm straw manning it here, but that's my 2 cents. All right, 30C, color breathing. The next technique is called color breathing and is designed to use the expanded awareness and highly focused attentiveness associated with Focus 12 state to imagine various colors in particularly intense and vivid manner, so as to use them to resonate and in turn activate the body's own energies. Fundamentally, in terms of practical application, it is a healing technique which is designed to restore the body and to enhance its physical capabilities by balancing, revitalizing, and reattuning bodily energy flows. It is predicated on the principle that the body's electromagnetic field is capable of altering its resonance pattern so as to entrain energy from the Earth's electromagnetic field for its own use. The various colors envisaged in the imagination as part of the technique cue the mind as to which frequencies and what specific amplitudes are desired in connection with this entrainment and the subsequent alterations in bodily energy flow patterns. That color has the capacity to affect the human mind is well known, and the effectuality of color in certain kinds of healing is a demonstrable fact. For example, application of an intense blue light to an area of physical tumescence leads to a relatively rapid and easily observable reduction in the swelling, while red and to a lesser effect yellow have quite the opposite effect. However, in the Hemi-Sync application of the technique, external light sources are not involved, but rather the mind is the sole agent of the healing and revitalization. Interesting. So again, we did a little bit of this in the retreat, but this is really providing a lot more theory on it here. So yeah, would like to know more about this too. All right, D, energy toolbar. Fond memories of this one. And by fond memories, I mean I definitely fell asleep, or if you want to be romantic about it, clicked out for most of this meditation. Anyway, energy bar tool. Magic wands and enchanted scepters have been part of the folklore and occult practices of many cultures. The scepters, staffs, and maces carried by monarchs and high priests alike occur with such frequency in the history of bygone eras as to suggest, at the very least, that these items are aspects of some type of archetypal symbol which the human mind seems to appreciate, perhaps quite subliminally. In any case, the energy bar tool technique involves envisaging a small, intensely pulsating dot of light which the participant charges in his imagination with enormous energy until it is virtually pulsating. The participant then extrudes the dot into the shape of a sparkling, vibrating cylinder of energy, which he uses to channel force from the universe to selected parts of his body for purposes of healing and revitalization. I mean, from the sound of it, you'd think this would be something I love, and I do love the idea of it. But it was anyway, anyone who's done the meditation, you probably know what I mean. All right, E, remote viewing. In addition, the energy bar tool is used as a portal for initiating a follow-up technique called remote viewing. In this context, the participant turns his bar of energy into a whirling vortex through which he sends his imagination in search of new and illuminating insights. The apparent purpose of the symbolism involved in the vortex seems to be to cue the subconscious and convey to it instructions as to what the participant wishes to do in terms of nonverbal symbols, which the right hemisphere of the mind is capable of understanding. Interesting. We did not do this at the retreat. No remote viewing. Again, that is something that there are like whole retreats dedicated to, but Yeah, obviously a very interesting topic and one that I've explored on the channel, but not personally, at least yet. F, living body map. This technique provides amplification for application of the energy bar tool as a means of healing specific areas or systems of the human body. The configuration of the participant's body is imagined, and then the various major systems of the nervous and circulatory systems are envisaged in appropriate colors within the confines of the outline being held in the imagination. The energy bar tool is then applied to energizing, balancing, and healing in whatever manner the participant desires. In the process, the participant visualizes various streams of colored energy flowing out of the tool into the organ system or area upon which the revitalizing or healing application is being made. Since colors are the result of differing wavelengths of light, which is to say energy at various frequencies, this technique operates on the assumption that the human body is composed of energy. It can be vitalized and healed through the additive application of additional energy provided that the energy provided, I guess there should be a comma, that the energy is applied in the appropriate form. Cookin, page 22, just a few pages left. Focus 15, travel into the past. So interesting right off the bat, they don't say focus 15 is travel into the past at the retreat. They refer to it as I believe, like a realm of timelessness where you are beyond time. So there is talk of time, but not specifically travel into the past. So this is interesting. This is something that must have evolved since this was written, or they want to divert from that explanation for some reason. I don't know. All of the preceding techniques are conducted at the level of expanded awareness known as Focus 12. However, the technique of time travel into the past involves further expansion of consciousness through the inclusion of additional levels of sound on Hemi-Sync tapes. Some of the sound is probably merely an intensification of the basic Hemi-Sync frequencies being designed to further modify brainwave frequency and amplitude. Other aspects of the added sound patterns appear to be designed to provide subtle, almost subliminal suggestions to the mind as to what is desired by way of further expanded consciousness, so as to support the verbal suggestions and instructions also contained on the tape. Even the instructions are highly symbolic, with time being visualized as a huge wheel in the universe with various spokes, each of which gives access to a different part of the participant's past. Focus 15 is a very advanced state, and it is extremely difficult to achieve. Probably less than 5% of all participants in any given gateway experience actually fully achieve the Focus 15 state during the course of the approximately 7 days of training. Nonetheless, Monroe Institute trainers affirm that with enough practice, eventually Focus 15 can be achieved. They also state that not only the individual's past history is available for examination by one who has achieved Focus 15, but other aspects of the past with which the individual himself has had no connection may also be accessed. Super interesting. Our Focus 15 meditations, to my memory, did not investigate this multi-spoked time wheel thing, but this is really cool. And it also drives home the core idea that you do have to practice these focus levels many, many times to really achieve what they're talking about here. So, useful information. And now, once again, moving on to Focus 21, the future. They, again, at the retreat, do not describe Focus 21 as the future. They refer to it as a bridge between worlds, which is equally kind of esoteric and cool, but different. Focus 21. The last and most advanced of all focus states associated with the Gateway Training Program involves movement outside of the boundaries of space-time, as in Focus 15, but with attention to discovering the future rather than the past. The individual who has achieved this state has reached a truly advanced level, except in unusual circumstances it is probably not attainable except by those who have conditioned themselves through long application of meditation, or by those who have practiced long and hard through use of the Hemi-Sync tapes for a period of months, if not years. And if you're wondering, okay, so then what is it like to do these techniques if you're not attaining the state? Deep relaxation feels like deep meditation. You're definitely on the precipice of waking and sleeping a lot of the time. There are oftentimes like mind's eye, qualitative visuals coming in, not on the intensity of like taking a tryptamine or a psychedelic or something, but it's still in that direction. It's very dreamy, it's very relaxed, subtle, with occasional punctuations of things that really reveal themselves to you. I'll just leave it at, your mind is like this huge MC Escher fractal labyrinth, and unless you get in there and really get in the lab, really explore the mind forest, you have no idea what's possible. All right, 31, out-of-body movement. This remarkable phenomenon has been saved for discussion in detail until last because of the interest which it occasions and special circumstances involved in its attainment. Monroe Institute stresses that the Gateway program was not established solely for the purpose of enabling participants to obtain the out-of-body state, nor does the program guarantee that most participants will succeed in doing it during the course of the training at the Institute. Only one tape out of many which make up the Gateway experience is devoted to the technique involved in the out-of-body movement. Basically, these techniques are merely designed to make it easier for the individual to achieve the out-of-body state when his brainwave pattern and personal energy levels have reached a point that he is in apparent harmony with his surrounding electromagnetic environment, such that he feels that he has reached the threshold where separation is a possibility. To facilitate achieving the out-of-body state, Bob Monroe, the founder of the Monroe Institute, is quoted in a recent magazine article saying that, in order to assist the participant, the particular Hemi-Sync tape concerned with that technique employs beta signals of around 2,877.3 CPS cycles per second, since 30 to 40 CPS is considered to be the normal range for beta brainwave signals, those associated with the wakeful state. It is apparent that the Monroe Institute is convinced that the same heightened state of brainwave frequency output which promotes altered states of consciousness is also an important consideration in assisting in out-of-body states. The actual techniques employed for separating from the body involve such simple maneuvers as rolling out, lifting out after the fashion of a telephone pole, wherein the individual separates in the rigid head-first manner, such that he finds himself standing at attention at the foot of his physical body and sliding out through either end of his body. Yep. Going out of body, as out there as it sounds, it is possible. It did happen to me. It's not because I'm some, deeply qualified person who really earned it. Ever since it's happened, I've been saying it's sort of like I slipped on a banana peel into the state. Was I doing tons of meditation? Yes. Was I playing with the borders of my consciousness and wakefulness and, all of the things that are being talked about in this? Yes, I was. Did I achieve the out-of-body state purposefully and through deliberate effort? No, it just kind of happened. I won't go into that whole story now. Again, watch the same video that I've been referring to if you want to see everything that led up to it and what happened. All right, 32, role of REM sleep. This one's a chunk. It is interesting to note that Bob Monroe informed the Gateway class that finished on the 7th of May 1983 that an ex-trainer of his operating in Charlottesville, Virginia, found that he could guarantee out-of-body movements by bringing participants down to a rapid eye movement state of sleep, and then use of the Hemi-Sync tape technique. This may well be a function of the fact that most, if not all people, reputedly go into an out-of-body state during REM sleep. REM sleep is the deepest possible level of ordinary sleep and involves complete disengagement of the body's motor cortex functions from the neck down and nearly complete suppression of consciousness in the left hemisphere of the brain. The effect of this is to put the body in a state of complete stillness so far as the skeletal muscle structure is concerned, thereby further promoting the state of deep rest needed to eliminate the bifurcation echo. In addition, it leaves the right hemisphere of the brain free to respond to the instructions and suggestions contained on the Gateway tape. However, use of the Hemi-Sync tapes at this point may be less a factor in actually achieving the out-of-body state than it is a matter of focusing the brain enough so that the residual memory of having naturally achieved the out-of-body state is carried into the waking state. Again, it may even be postulated that some dreams associated with deep levels of sleep are in fact functions of the same kind of altered consciousness, involved in interaction with the universe that plays a role in all of the focus 12, 15, and 21 states described above. The difference between those states and the condition of the mind in REM sleep seems to be that the left hemisphere is almost totally disengaged in the latter experience, such that the memory of what was achieved in the altered states of consciousness cannot usually be retrieved by conscious desire, because the left hemisphere has no knowledge of its existence or its location in the right hemisphere. Admittedly, some people can be trained to remember their REM state dreams through intense conditioning in the waking state, but even that may be more a function of establishing pathways in the right hemisphere, which the left hemisphere can access following re-entry into the wakeful state, than it is an indication of any specific left hemisphere conscious involvement in the process during REM sleep. In any event, the three apparent conditions required for voluntarily inducing an out-of-body state in most individuals seems to be 1. Achievement of a state of profound quiet in the body, such that the bifurcation echo fades and resonance at approximately 7 Hz is established. 2. Synchronization of the two brain hemisphere wave patterns. And 3. Subsequent stimulation of the right hemisphere of the mind to attain a state of heightened alertness, which of course interferes with brain hemisphere synchronization, but not until a sufficient level of enhanced frequency range has first been established to help achieve out-of-body state, the out-of-body state. All right, yes, REM sleep deeply seems to be important for going out of body. A few quick notes to emphasize and touch on here. Robert Monroe does say that people go out of body unconsciously often, if not every night, during really, really deep sleep states, so deep that you have no conscious memory of doing it. And, they also touch on here the importance of basically having the physical body completely shut down so that this other body, or whatever you want to call it, is online, and that when you try to move the physical body, it's not the physical body that moves, it's this other body. And that's what happened to me. Like, I was in this extraordinarily vivid, so I guess I'm going into the story now, during the meditation where I slipped into the out-of-body state, I was in an extraordinarily vivid, kind of lucid dream or clicked out state where I felt like I was in this room. Like, I'm just chilling in this meditation, very relaxed, having a really lovely, relaxed time. Nothing particularly strange happening, though. And then suddenly I'm just like a finger snaps and I am literally feel like I'm standing in a room looking out a window, and it feels incredibly real, incredibly, just tactile, everything. But I realize, like, no, I'm not in this room. I'm meditating in the check unit in the bed at Monroe Institute. And then my awareness goes back to my physical body. I'm fully like, okay, here I am meditating again. But I'm feeling this intense rushing of energy that they talk about, that Robert Monroe talks about, that's probably been touched on in this paper. And, that intense rushing is almost uncomfortable. So I try to move my physical body. My physical body doesn't move. I feel the separation of the non-physical self come off my body, lift off the body. It's absolutely surreal. It's absolutely just indisputable. It's not one of those things. It's like, maybe I went out. No, it's like you got in a car accident. It's like someone slapped you in the face. It's as real as anything you can experience. I'll leave it at that. 33, information collection potential. The information acquisition potential associated with the out-of-body state seems to attract the most attention from the standpoint of developing practical applications for the gateway technique. Unfortunately, although the out-of-body state can apparently be achieved by many people without excessive expenditure of time or effort, the purposes to which it can be put are currently limited by the fact that although individuals in that state may travel anywhere on an instantaneous basis in either the terrestrial or in other spheres, information distortion in the former context remains a major concern. To date, according to one of the trainers at Monroe Institute, numerous experiments have been conducted involving persons moving from one coast to the other in an out-of-body state to read a series of 10 computer-generated numbers in a university laboratory. Although most have acquired enough of the digits to make clear that their consciousness was present, none have ever succeeded in getting all 10 correct. This seems to be a function of the fact that the physical reality in the present is not the only holographic influence which the individual may encounter in an out-of-body state. There are also energy patterns left by people or events occurring at the same physical site being viewed, but from the past rather than the present. In addition, since thoughts are the product of energy patterns, and energy patterns are reality, it may also be possible that individuals encounter thought forms while in the out-of-body state, which mingle with physical reality and are not easily differentiated. Finally, as Melissa Yeager writes, there is another potential problem area in the sense that holograms can be viewed pseudo-scoptically. That is to say, inside out or backwards, just as well as they can be seen in proper perspective. Some of the distortions occurring may ultimately prove to be traceable to this cause, because in the out-of-body state, an individual may perceive the holographic energy patterns given off by people or things interacting in space-time reality in a somewhat distorted form. So this is the kind of stuff that's absolutely above my pay grade. I did not leave my little room at the Monroe Institute. So the phenomenology of what that is really like, I don't know. And, I think, if you're a skeptic, you could just say, well, yeah, of course they couldn't get all 10 of those digits right because this is a bunch of bullshit, or this isn't real, or this is a dream of some kind. But I think that's straw manning. I think that there's a lot of reason to believe that we should at least take this seriously and at least take this plausibly because of so many people that have experienced this state. And I know of specific instances as well where people were able to, see things on other people's tables, for instance, at the Monroe Institute. Check out Chris Ramsey's video. His friend is able to kind of like remote view in an out-of-body state something in someone else's room. And again, of course, these are anecdotes. Anyway, I don't think we should straw man it. I think we should at least take it as a serious possibility that this can be done. All right, 34 belief system considerations. In 1967, Alexandra David Neal and Liam Yongden, or rather Lama, wrote a book titled The Secret Oral Teachings in Tibetan Buddhist Sects, from which the following quote is taken. Quote, "The tangible world is movement, say the masters, not a collection of moving objects, but movement itself. There are no objects in movement. It is the movement which constitutes the objects which appear to us. They are nothing but movement. This movement is continued, an infinitely rapid succession of flashes of energy. In Tibetan, the word tsal, T-S-A-L, or shog, S-H-O-U-G, is used. All objects perceptible to our senses, all phenomena of whatever kind and whatever aspect they may assume, are constituted by a rapid succession of instantaneous events. The classic description of the universal hologram is to be found in the Hindu Sutra, which says, quote, "In the heaven of Indra, there is said to be a network of pearls so arranged that if you look at one, you will see all the others reflected in it." Yes, Indra's net of jewels. Love it. I have cited this quotation because it shows that the concept of the universe, which at least some physicists are now coming to accept, is identical in its essential aspects with the one known to the learned elite in selected civilizations and cultures of high attainment in the ancient world. The concept of the cosmic egg, for example, is well known to scholars familiar with the ancient writings of Eastern religions. See, that's interesting because immediately I think of the Greek Orphic egg. I'll flash that up on the screen here. Nor are their theories presented in this paper at variance with the essential tenets of the Judeo-Christian stream of thought. The concept of visible reality, i.e. the created world, as being an emanation of an omnipotent and omniscient divinity who is completely unknowable in his primary state of being. The absolute at rest in infinity is a concept straight out of Hebrew mystical philosophy. Yeah, I think this would be like the Ein Sof of the Kabbalists. Even the Christian concept of the Trinity shines through the description of the absolute presented in this paper. The description of energy totally at rest in infinity fits the Christian metaphysical concept of the Father, while the infinite self-consciousness resident in that energy, providing the motive force of will to bring a portion of that energy into motion to create reality corresponds with the sun. This is so because in order to attain self-consciousness, the consciousness of the absolute must project a hologram of itself and then perceive it. That hologram is a mirror image of the absolute in infinity. Typo here maybe? That hologram is a mirror image of the absolute in infinity. Still exists outside space and time, but is one step removed from the absolute and is the actual agent of all creation and reality. And the eternal thought or concept of self, which results from this self-consciousness, serves the absolute as the model around which the evolution of space-time revolves to ultimately attain a reflection of and union with him. That thought model, which perfectly reflects the essence or spirit of the absolute, fits the Christian metaphysical description of the Holy Spirit. Finally, our description of the universal hologram, the torus of creation and evolution, is neither new nor original. Its use as the figure of the universe of creation developing in evolution is found in various stylized representations in virtually every religious system of antiquity, whether the Eastern or Western derivation. Whether it's the stylized labyrinth once popular in the Hellenic world, the spiraled version of the Hebrew tree of life, or its Hindu counterpart, or the Chinese spiral through the fourfold powers, the ultimate meaning is the same. Mystics the world over, it seems, have perceived the universal hologram in the same spiral form and have incorporated that intuitive knowledge in their religious writings from antiquity to the present. Woo! Some chunky run-on sentences once again, but I love the sentiment here that there is this universal wisdom, there is this perennial philosophy that all rivers lead to the same ocean, and that all these mystics were on to this same truth, that there is this universal consciousness, this absolute, or if you want to call it God, you can call it God. I would have loved them to plug the Platonists and the Hermeticists because it definitely fits with their metaphysics too, but I'll forgive you, Lieutenant Colonel McDonald. 35 left brain limitations. 20th century physics would seem to be revisiting insights belonging to mankind as far back as written records take us. The only difference is that 20th century physics is using a left brain linear quantitative style of reasoning to approach the same knowledge, which the mystics of old apparently acquired in a holistic intuitional right brain style. As a tool for achieving the intuitive holistic type of interface with the universal hologram needed to provide the context that thinkers like Einstein have sought in their labors to discover a unified field theory in physics. What is this sentence? Seriously. As a tool in the hands of our left brain culture, Gateway would seem to be a promising method for achieving the intuitive holistic type of interface with the universal hologram needed to provide the context that thinkers like Einstein have sought in their labors to discover a unified field theory of physics. Again, I emphasize, I really love you, Mr. Wayne McDonald, but I break up these sentences. I mean, travel back in time 40 years using the method and break up these sentences a little more. For persons in our profession whose concerns revolve around strategic issues, tactical questions, and matters of managerial form and system, access to a new world of intuitive perception and self-reflection would seem to offer, in the long term, the means by which to know in a truly objective way. I'm going to stop commenting on the sentences, I promise, but come on. This is so because the self-imposed limitations to balanced perception and objective logic, which our cultural and personal psychological subjectivity imposes when we use the strictly left brain thinking style, could be offset by the holistic form of perception associated with altered states of consciousness. To the extent that we come to perceive ourselves fully in the context of that portion of the universal hologram, which is the reflection of ourselves, to the extent that we release ourselves from the prison of subjectivity. Double to the extent in this sentence. So bringing that chunk of words and ideas home, basically what they're saying, I think it can be summed up pretty quickly here. 20th century physics would seem to be revisiting insights belonging to mankind as far back as written records can take us. That part is essentially, I think, the important takeaway here. Mystics, since time immemorial, have been doing this in a more right-brained way, a more intuitive way, and now left brain, analytical brain, physics brain, math brain is catching up. And, you know, there's this comment I get often if I have people like Dr. Donald Hoffman on, where people will say, like, they said this 2,000 years ago and 4,000 years ago. In a way, yes. But it's important, I think, to acknowledge the difficulty involved for one, and the practical takeaways that come from making these connections in a left-brained way. This is how you get this stuff from ethereal, philosophical, spiritual ideas into science, and then that leads to actual breakthroughs in our understanding of physical reality, which leads to improvements in technology. I think the kind of improvements and breakthroughs that we can't even begin to imagine right now. All right, 36, self-knowledge. It was axiomatic to the mystic philosophers of old that the first step in personal maturity could be expressed in the aphorism, know thyself. To them, the education of a man undertook as its primary step achievement of an introverted focus so that he learned what was within himself before attempting to approach the outside world. They rightly assumed that he could not effectively evaluate and cope with the world until he fully understood his personal psychological balance. The insights being provided by 20th century psychology in this context, through the use of various kinds of personality testing, seem to be a revalidation of this ancient intuition. But no personality test or series of tests will ever replace the depth and fullness of the perception of self, which can be achieved when the mind alters its state of consciousness sufficiently to perceive the very hologram of itself, which it has projected into the universe in its proper context as part of the universal hologram in a totally holistic and intuitional way. This would seem to be one of the real promises, I think it should be, of the gateway experience from the standpoint of its ability to provide a portal through which, based on months if not years of practice, the individual may pass in his search to find self, personal effectuality, and truth in the larger sense. By the way, I guess I should note that this is the fabled missing page. The version of this paper that was declassified was originally missing this page, which led to a lot of questions like, was the page omitted purposefully? Was it redacted? Is there something so mind-blowing on this page? And then there was an article that Vice did years ago where they did some really cool reporting where they personally reached out to the Monroe Institute and they were like, what's up with this missing page? Do you have the report? Can we have the report from you? And then after some back and forth, Monroe voluntarily gave up the full paper with the missing page. And though I think in the grand scheme of the paper, maybe it's not like the most mind-blowing climactic punchline or chunk of information, I do think it is important and it contains some deeply fascinating info. All right, 37, motivational aspect. It is a step-by-step procedure which involves repetitive practice of the techniques concerned, using each new insight as a means of penetrating further during the next practice session. But the rate of progress is so much faster with the gateway approach than it is with transcendental meditation or other forms of mental self-discipline, and its horizons seem to be so much wider that the discipline needed to practice it would seem to be within the means of even the impatient, result-oriented, skeptical pragmatist of our society. Unlike yoga and other forms of Eastern mental discipline, Gateway does not require the infinite patience and total personal subservience to and faith in a system of discipline designed to absorb all the individual's energies over most of a lifetime. Rather, it will begin to produce at least minimal results within a relatively short time, definitely true in my case, such that enough feedback is available to motivate and energize the individual to continue working with it. Indeed, the speed with which an individual may expect to progress seems less a function of a number of hours spent practicing than it is a question of the speed with which he or she is able to use the insights gained to release anxieties and stresses within both the mind and the body. These points of energy blockage seem to provide the principal barriers to achieving the enhanced energy states and focus of mind needed for rapid progression. The more compulsive, the more uptight the individual may be at the outset, the more barriers he or she will initially encounter to achieving a deep, immediate experience. But as the insights begin to come and the blockages begin to dissolve, the way ahead becomes increasingly clear, and the value of Gateway moves from the status of a matter of intellectual assessment to one of personal experience. And here we are, my friends. Conclusion. There is a sound rational basis in terms of physical science parameters for considering Gateway to be plausible in terms of its essential objectives. Institutional insights of not only personal, but of a practical and professional nature would seem to be within the bounds of reasonable expectations. However, a phased approach for entering the Gateway experience in an accelerated mode would seem to be required if the time needed to reach advanced states of altered consciousness is to be brought within the more manageable limits from the standpoint of establishing an organization-wide exploitation of Gateway's potential. The most promising approach suggested in the foregoing study involves the following steps. A. Begin by using the Gateway Hemi-Sync tapes to achieve enhanced brain focus and to induce hemispheric synchronization. B. Then add strong REM sleep frequencies to induce left brain quiescence and deep physical relaxation. C. Provide hypnotic suggestion designed to enable an individual to induce deep auto-hypnotic state at will. That's interesting. D. Use auto-hypnotic suggestion to attain much enhanced focus of concentration and motivation in rapidly progressing through Focus 12 exercises. E. Then repeat steps A and B following use of auto-hypnotic suggestion that an out-of-body movement will occur and be remembered. F. Repeat step E to achieve facility in gaining out-of-body state under conscious control. Alter hypnotic suggestion to stress ability to consciously control out-of-body movement and maintain it even after REM sleep state ends. G. Approach Focus 15 and Focus 21 objectives. Escape from time-space and interact within new dimensions from the out-of-body perspective. H. This one's one of my favorites. I've definitely puzzled over this one before. I can't wait to let this one rip and hear what you all think in the comments. H. Use multi-focus approach to solve problem of distortion in terrestrial information gathering trips. This approach involves the use of 3 individuals in the out-of-body state, one viewing the target object here in space-time, one viewing it at Focus 15 as it slips into the immediate past, one viewing it at Focus 21 as it slips from the immediate future. Debrief all 3 and compare data gathered from the 3 points of view. If care is taken to ensure that the 3 all go out of body together in the same environment, their conscious energy systems should resonate in sympathetic oscillation. They can tune into the same target on different planes, dimensions, with greater effectiveness. Insert head explosion GIF. But we are not done. There's a couple brain melters left in these last few points. Point I. Encourage pursuit of full self-knowledge by all individuals involved in the foregoing experiments to enhance objectivity in out-of-body observation and thinking, and to remove personal energy blockages likely to retard rapid progress. J. Be intellectually prepared. This is a good one. Be intellectually prepared to react to possible encounters with intelligent non-corporeal energy forms when time-space boundaries are exceeded. So evocative of the whole NHI conversation right now. But there's more. This next point in particular. And this one might be the most brain-melting of all. Arrange to have groups of people in Focus 12 state unite their altered consciousness to build holographic patterns around sensitive areas to repulse possible unwanted out-of-body presences. I don't know if this is speculation. I don't know if this has been done. I don't know what that even means, to be honest with you. I get the point. I get what they're alluding to. But how that can be done, I have no idea. All right. Final point, L. Encourage more advanced Gateway participants to build... Oh yeah, this continued from the last one. encouraged more advanced gateway participants to build holographic patterns of successful attainment and rapid progress for advanced colleagues to assist them in progressing through the gateway system. If these experiments are carried through, it is to be hoped that we will truly find a gateway to gateway, into the realm of practical application for the whole system of techniques which comprise it. And that is it, my friends. That is the balance of the Gateway Report. But I think we need some reflection, and I think we need some takeaways. I think we need to reassess why this is so still incredibly pertinent and interesting, even over 40 years later. If you're anything like me, your mind at this point is just swimming with ideas and questions. So before we conclude our exploration of this document, there's some really vital reflection that we need to do. At its core, this document is more than just a weird government experiment in consciousness expansion. It represents an attempt to map the connection between the mind, reality, and the very fabric of existence itself. Of course, the document suggests that consciousness is not just an epiphenomena or byproduct of our brains, but that we live in a conscious, interconnected universe. And of course, all of this, if you follow the channel and the philosophy of consciousness at all, strongly harmonizes with the philosophy of people like Dr. Donald Hoffman, Bernardo Kastrup, and Federico Fagin, who also argue that consciousness is not an emergent property of matter, but rather the fundamental basis of reality itself. And another thing that makes this document all the more compelling is the possibility that these techniques are still in use today. According to the recent testimony of UFO whistleblower Jake Barber, there are indications that methods similar to those described in this paper may currently be in use in the training of psionic assets. And if you haven't been following this story and you're interested in this topic, you absolutely have to. A huge part of his story hinges on the idea that these psionic assets are very real and very much in use by the military and aerospace contractors, which obviously implies that all of this consciousness research did not come to an end with the closure of endeavors like Project Stargate. In fact, they may have evolved considerably since then. And on that note, I think some other good closing thoughts are the fact that this reminds us that consciousness is not just some really out there philosophical conversation. It's a real experiential frontier that encompasses everything from the nature of reality and our place in it to the covert strategies employed by intelligence agencies. It encourages us to ask if our minds can truly transcend space and time, and what else we might be capable of as human beings. And of course, that leaves the throbbing question of how much of these questions do we already know the answers to, but we, as the public, are left in the dark because they're hidden behind closed doors within classified programs. But in closing, that's the beautiful thing about this method and about meditation and all these other angles that we have at our disposal for consciousness exploration. You don't need them to tell you what's real. You can experiment with your own consciousness and decide for yourself. And with that, if you found this thought-provoking, do tickle that algorithm, like, sub, comment, share. Check out the Third Eye Drops podcast wherever you listen to those. We've got hundreds of mind melds with really brilliant beings that will never be posted here. And we'd love to have you in the Wonder Lodge at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. It's the best way to support the show, and you also get rewards like a patron-only Discord server. We do a book club. We do Zoom hangs. You can get stickers, pins, shirts, and more. Massive, excessive love to all the patrons, and much love to all of you watching, my friends. We'll see you in the next one.